I am Rosalind Harris, 34 years old. For 5 years, my family treated my life savings like a punchline. They called my land a mud pit. They told their country club friends I was a naive fool digging in the dirt, while my younger sister married a financial genius. I swallowed their jokes. I kept working. Then I sold that same barren dirt for $93 million. I told no one. I kept driving my old Subaru. I kept my mouth shut. Until my mother found out. Suddenly, the family that called me a failure demanded $46 million to buy my sister a sprawling estate and fund her husband's business. My mother announced this forced donation in front of 50 people at a formal dinner, expecting the social pressure to make me cave. I did not cave. I smiled, stood up, and initiated a chain of events that ended with federal agents, a foreclosure, and a bulldozer tearing down my parents' legacy. If you have ever been the family scapegoat, the one whose choices were mocked, until those same people showed up with their hands out, you understand this quiet rage. Before I walk you through exactly how I dismantled their house of cards, please hit that like button and subscribe to Morning Revenge. I always want to know who is coming along for the ride, so drop your age and your city in the comments below. Now picture a Tuesday night in downtown Bismarck, North Dakota. The snow was falling thick, piling up against the frosted windows of the Oak Room Steakhouse. The wind chill was well below zero, but inside the private dining area, the air felt suffocating. My parents, William and Barbara, were celebrating 40 years of marriage. The long mahogany table was crowded with extended family business associates and neighbors. Waiters in crisp white shirts moved seamlessly around us, pouring expensive red wine and clearing plates stained with the juices of prime rib. I sat near the middle of the table, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching the performance. My family treated every public gathering like a stage play, and everyone had an assigned role. William sat at the head of the table in a charcoal suit, laughing loud enough to ensure everyone heard him. Barbara sat to his right, in a tailored emerald dress, her neck wrapped in pearls. Across from me sat my younger sister, Stephanie. She wore a silk blouse and a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the warm light of the chandeliers. Beside her was Bradley, her husband. He wore a designer watch and reeked of expensive cologne. He spent the entire dinner swirling amber whiskey in his glass, leaning back in his leather chair like he owned the building. I was the quiet older sister, the agricultural consultant who lived in a modest apartment. That was the role they assigned me. I wore a simple black dress and kept my hands folded in my lap. For months I had been hiding a secret worth 9 figures. My assets were locked behind non-disclosure agreements and anonymous trusts. No one at this table was supposed to know. Then Barbara reached for her silver spoon. She tapped it against the rim of her crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clear ringing sliced through the low murmur of conversation. The room quieted. Faces turned toward her, expectant, offering polite smiles. She stood up. The candlelight caught the calculated glint in her eyes. I knew my mother's toasts. They were usually thinly veiled exercises in boasting about Stephanie's perfect marriage or William's golf handicap. 40 years, Barbara began, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of a seasoned socialite. William and I have built a life on the foundation of family. We have weathered storms, celebrated triumphs, and learned that nothing brings a mother more joy than seeing her children support one another. Her gaze shifted. It bypassed Stephanie. It bypassed Bradley. It landed squarely on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My pulse thudded against my ribs, a fast, steady rhythm that I masked by taking a slow sip of my water. I noticed a subtle shift in Stephanie's posture. She sat up straighter, her eyes locked on her plate, a small smile playing on her lips. As some of you may have heard, Barbara continued, her tone dripping with artificial sweetness, Rosalind has recently encountered a stroke of financial luck. A windfall, you might call it. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The casual warmth vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating expectation. Aunts and uncles exchanged curious glances. My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, watching me with a look of intense greed. The secret was out. I did not know how, and I did not know when, but the facade was over. And true to the Harris spirit, my mother announced, raising her glass higher, Rosalind has made a breathtakingly generous decision. She is gifting her sister $46 million. A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. Someone at the far end of the table dropped a fork. It clattered loudly against a porcelain plate. Stephanie covered her mouth with manicured hands, feigning profound shock. She produced a flawless expression of tearful gratitude, looking across the table at me with wide, shining eyes. "Oh, Rosalind," she whispered loud enough for the people next to her to hear. "You shouldn't have." Bradley did not act shocked. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany wood. He looked at me, not with gratitude, but with sheer entitlement. He raised his whiskey glass toward me, offering a slow nod. He looked like a man who had already spent the money, a man who believed he was collecting a debt. With this gift, Barbara's voice swelled over the rising applause. Stephanie and Bradley will finally secure their dream estate, and Bradley can fund the expansion of his commercial real estate firm. To family. To family, the table echoed. 24 glasses rose into the air. They looked at me. They waited for my gracious nod, my tearful acceptance of this forced philanthropy. It was a tactical ambush. They were using the weight of public expectation, the presence of our entire extended family and their affluent friends, to corner me into compliance. They assumed I would be too embarrassed, too ingrained in my role as the compliant daughter, to refuse them in public. I did not break eye contact with Bradley. I watched the smug certainty resting on his face. Slowly, I reached for my linen napkin. I folded it neatly in half, then in quarters, and set it beside my untouched plate. I placed my hands on the edge of the table and pushed my chair back. The wood scraped harshly against the floorboards, a jarring noise that pierced the fading applause. I stood up. The room held its breath. The smiles on the faces of my aunts and uncles faltered, replaced by confusion. I looked at Barbara, whose emerald dress suddenly looked dull. I looked at William, whose confident posture stiffened. I looked at Stephanie, whose fake tears dried up in an instant. Finally, I looked at Bradley. "You are delusional," I said. My voice was not loud. I did not yell. I did not shake. But in that dead silent room, the words carried like a gunshot. Barbara's smile froze. A dark flush crept up her neck. "Rosalind," she hissed, dropping the socialite persona. "Do not make a scene." "There is no gift," I stated, my gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of my relatives. "There will never be a gift. Enjoy your prime rib." I turned my back on them. I did not wait for William to shout my name. I did not wait for Stephanie to start her real crying. I walked past the waiters holding trays of dessert, pushed through the heavy oak doors of the dining room, and stepped out into the lobby. The valet brought my 10-year-old Subaru around. I handed him a $20 tip, climbed into the freezing driver's seat, and gripped the steering wheel. My hands were shaking now, but not from fear. The war had been declared, and they had no idea what kind of ammunition I was holding. The heater in my Subaru blasted dry air against my face as I pulled onto the highway. The city lights of Bismarck faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the endless stretch of winter darkness. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. William, Barbara, Stephanie. Their names illuminated the screen, one after another, demanding answers, demanding obedience. I flipped the phone face down. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make my knuckles ache. To understand why my family felt entitled to a fortune tonight, you have to understand how they treated me 5 years ago. You have to understand the dirt. 5 years ago, I was a mid-level agricultural consultant, crisscrossing the state testing soil samples for corporate farming conglomerates. I lived out of cheap roadside motels, saving every paycheck, eating canned soup over a hot plate, and wearing work boots patched with duct tape. I had a singular vision. I wanted to build a specialized botanical research farm, cultivating drought-resistant crops for arid climates. I found the perfect parcel in Williams County, 500 acres of rough, wind-scoured terrain. The real estate agent looked at me like I was throwing my life away when I signed the closing documents. The earth was cracked, covered in brittle sagebrush, and baked hard by the summer sun. I drained my savings account down to the last dime to secure the deed. I did not take a loan from a bank, and I certainly did not ask my parents for a penny. The land was mine. When I brought the deed home to show my family, expecting at least a nod of respect for becoming a landowner, I was met with sheer contempt. My family worshipped status. William managed a regional bank branch, and Barbara spent her days curating a pristine image among the local country club wives. They measured human worth in luxury vehicles, zip codes, and designer labels. To them, my remote acreage was an embarrassment. Barbara told her bridge club I had purchased a mud pit in the middle of nowhere. William told his golf buddies I was suffering from a quarter-life crisis and throwing my potential down a drain. I became the cautionary tale. Whenever extended relatives visited, my parents would sigh and lower their voices, discussing my poor life choices as if I had a terminal illness. Meanwhile, Stephanie was securing her engagement to Bradley. Bradley was a smooth-talking commercial real estate broker who drove a leased sports car and paid for expensive dinners with shiny credit cards. He was the golden child by marriage. He spoke in corporate buzzwords and always remembered to compliment Barbara's jewelry. I was the spinster playing in the mud. The psychological conditioning of being the family disappointment is a slow, quiet poison. It conditions you to accept the backhanded compliments, the pitying looks from aunts and uncles, the constant draining sensation that you are taking up space in a world built for better people. Barbara would leave brochures for secretarial jobs on my kitchen counter when she visited my apartment. William would ask when I was going to get a real job with health insurance, usually doing so in front of an audience. That toxic dynamic peaked during our family Thanksgiving dinner 4 years ago. The setting was nearly identical to the steakhouse ambush, a lavish dining room in my parents' sprawling colonial home, fine china plates, and an audience of relatives eager for free entertainment. We had just finished the main course. The smell of roasted turkey and heavy gravy lingered in the warm air. William stood up holding a large, crudely wrapped cardboard box. He carried it to my end of the table and dropped it heavily onto my lap. The cardboard hit my thighs with a dull thud. He announced to the room that he had an early Christmas present to help with my new career. I pulled away the wrapping paper. Inside sat a pair of cheap, bright yellow rubber boots, the kind you buy for a toddler to splash in puddles. Laughter erupted around the table. It was not gentle laughter. It was the sharp, biting sound of a group bonding over a shared target. Bradley chuckled from across the table, swirling his expensive wine. Stephanie leaned over and placed a manicured hand on my shoulder. Her voice dripped with artificial sympathy as she told me they just wanted to make sure I stayed clean out there in the wilderness. William stood at the head of the table, his face flushed from the heat of the room and the alcohol in his veins. He looked down at me, a wide grin stretching across his face, and delivered a line I will never forget. "You are going to be digging in the dirt for the rest of your life, Rosalind. Enjoy the mud." He was right. I would be digging in the dirt, but he had no idea what lay beneath the surface of my land. To my family, those 500 acres represented a worthless mud pit, a towering symbol of my failure to conform to their shallow expectations. To me, that brittle earth meant independence. It was the one place on earth where their condescending voices could not reach me, where the wind drowned out their mockery. I did not throw the boots back at him. I did not stand up and shout. I did not shed a single tear. I smiled, thanked him for the thoughtful gift, and placed the box on the floor beneath my chair. I swallowed the humiliation whole, letting it burn in the back of my throat. That night, driving back to my cramped apartment, I made a silent vow in the dark cabin of my car. I would build my research farm. I would turn that barren soil into something undeniable. I would succeed entirely without their help, without their approval, and I would never let them take a fraction of the credit for my labor. I spent the next 4 years mapping every inch of those 500 acres. I took core samples, I analyzed the mineral composition, I braved sub-zero winters and scorching summers digging deep into the exact dirt William had laughed at. And I found something. I found something that caught the attention of a global tech conglomerate, something that turned my worthless mud pit into a $93 million secret. But keeping a secret that large while pretending to be the poor struggling sister is a dangerous game. It requires lying to the people you see every Sunday. It requires hiding your true life in plain sight. And as I was about to learn, secrets have a way of leaving a paper trail, especially when your mother decides she has a right to read your mail. The lab results arrived on a Tuesday, carrying a string of chemical compounds I barely recognized. I had sent the deep core samples to a facility in Denver, expecting a standard breakdown of nitrogen, phosphorus, and soil alkalinity. I needed to know if my arid 500 acres could sustain the experimental drought-resistant crops I planned to cultivate. Instead, the chief geologist called my personal cell phone. He asked if I was sitting down. He asked if anyone else knew the exact GPS coordinates of my parcel. The brittle wind scoured earth William had mocked was not a mud pit. It was a geological anomaly. Beneath the cracked topsoil and the stubborn sagebrush lay an untouched, highly concentrated vein of rare earth minerals. Neodymium, praseodymium, elements that the global technology sector desperately required to manufacture smartphone batteries, electric vehicle engines, and advanced military aerospace components. The domestic supply chain was starved for these exact resources. Furthermore, the survey revealed an isolated, high-yield commercial aquifer resting just beneath the bedrock, granting the property coveted commercial water rights in a region prone to severe droughts. I did not have dirt. I had leverage. If you are tuning into this story on Morning Revenge, you already know that the sweetest victories are the silent ones. Make sure to follow the channel if you believe true power is holding your cards close to your chest. 6 months after that phone call, a fleet of black corporate SUVs rolled down the dusty gravel road leading to my property line. Representatives from a multinational tech conglomerate stepped out into the freezing wind wearing expensive wool overcoats and polished leather shoes that immediately sank into the thawing spring mud. They looked at me, a woman in a heavy canvas work jacket and faded denim, and they saw an easy mark. They assumed I was an uneducated local who would faint at the sight of a 7-figure check. Their initial offer was $3 million. They smiled condescendingly, explaining how the extraction process was complex and the permitting would be a headache. They used corporate jargon, trying to dizzy me into signing away the deed on the hood of their vehicle. I looked at the lead negotiator, a tall man with a silver tie, and handed him my own independent geological survey, verified by 2 separate engineering firms. I included the water rights appraisal. I told him the baseline opening bid was $80 million, and if they hesitated, I had a direct contact at their primary overseas competitor, who was waiting for my call. The smug smiles vanished. The polished shoes shifted uncomfortably in the mud. The negotiation took 3 agonizing weeks of conference calls, legal posturing, and high-stakes brinkmanship. I did not involve a single member of my family. I did not ask William for banking advice. I did not ask Bradley to review the real estate contracts. I hired an elite corporate attorney out of Chicago, a woman who specialized in bulletproof non-disclosure agreements and impenetrable wealth shielding. We settled the final buyout at $93 million. The execution of the sale was a ghost operation. I formed an anonymous holding company named Silver Sage Equities. The corporate purchaser required strict confidentiality to prevent local land speculation, which suited my purposes perfectly. There were no press releases. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony. The county deed transfer listed a vague corporate entity out of Delaware. To the residents of Bismarck, and more importantly to my family, I was still the eccentric spinster failing to grow weeds on a barren patch of wilderness. The transaction finalized on a Thursday evening in late November. I was sitting alone in my cramped 1-bedroom apartment. The radiator clanked in the corner, struggling to push heat into the living room. The glow of the street lamp outside filtered through cheap plastic blinds, casting long horizontal shadows across my faded second-hand sofa. My phone vibrated on the coffee table. It was a secure message from my wealth manager in Chicago, confirming the wire transfer had cleared the Federal Reserve Network. I opened my banking application. The screen illuminated my face in the dark room. There, staring back at me in stark white font against a blue background, was a 9-figure balance. $93 million. I did not scream. I did not jump up and down. I sat in the quiet dark, listening to the rattling heater, feeling a strange, hollow weight settle into my bones. The sheer scale of the wealth was incomprehensible. It was the kind of money that buys politicians, changes skylines, and alters family lineages forever. It was also the kind of money that turns relatives into predators. I walked into my narrow kitchen. I did not own champagne. I opened the refrigerator and pulled out a $10 bottle of gas station Pinot Grigio. The label was slightly peeling at the corner. I twisted the metal screw cap until it cracked, poured a generous measure into a plain glass tumbler, and took a sip. The wine was cheap tart and burned slightly on the way down. I memorized that exact taste. I memorized the metallic click of the cap, the heavy glass in my hand, and the dim yellow light of my refrigerator bulb. I promised myself I would never forget the woman who drank cheap wine in the dark, because that woman had just outsmarted everyone who ever looked down on her. That specific bottle of wine, with its peeling label and cheap screw cap, would make another appearance. But I am getting ahead of the story. For the next 6 months, I perfected the art of the charade. I woke up every morning at 6, put on my scuffed work boots, and drove my 10-year-old Subaru out to the county limits. I parked on a small, retained acre of the land that the tech company allowed me to lease back for optics. I tested soil. I wrote agricultural reports for my old clients. I lived on my modest salary. The real challenge was Sunday dinners at my parents' colonial home. I sat at the same mahogany table eating Barbara's dry pot roast, wearing a frayed wool sweater. I listened to Stephanie complain about the interior designer for her new kitchen remodel. I listened to Bradley brag about his commercial real estate yields, using words like liquidity and asset leveraging while subtly checking his reflection in his silverware. I listened to William offer me unsolicited financial advice, telling me I needed to start contributing to a mutual fund before I aged out of the workforce with zero equity. I smiled. I nodded. I thanked them for their wisdom. The internal power shift was intoxicating. When Barbara made a passive-aggressive comment about the scuff marks on my boots, I did not feel the familiar sting of shame. Instead, I felt a deep, silent amusement. I knew I had enough liquid capital resting in a diversified portfolio to buy her house, bulldoze it, and build a private park without noticing a dent in my ledger. I did not need their validation anymore. I was a ghost, watching them perform a play I had already written the ending to. But paranoia is a heavy coat to wear. Every time the phone rang, every time a bank statement arrived in the mail, my heart rate spiked. I had fortified my life with elite legal armor, but the weakest link in any fortress is always human error. You can hire the most expensive attorneys in the country to draft airtight confidentiality clauses, but you cannot legislate the loose lips of a local land surveyor. You cannot predict a careless whisper in a small-town bar. And most dangerously, you can never underestimate the sheer predatory entitlement of a mother who believes she has the divine right to unlock your front door and open your private mail. The fortress was about to crack, and the invasion was going to come directly from the inside. A fortress is only as strong as its quietest guard. I paid elite attorneys thousands of dollars an hour to construct an impenetrable digital vault around my assets. We built holding companies inside holding companies. We drafted non-disclosure agreements with punitive financial damages so severe they would bankrupt anyone who spoke my name. Corporate law, however, cannot police a rural dive bar on a Friday night. Bismarck operates like a small town masquerading as a state capital. Everyone is connected by 2 degrees of separation. The tech conglomerate that purchased my land hired an independent environmental surveying firm to finalize their permits. A man named Greg worked for that firm. Greg liked to drink cheap beer at a local tavern called the Rusty Nail. After 3 pints, Greg liked to talk. My mother built her entire social standing on gossip. She served on the charity gala committee not to raise funds, but to trade whispers with the wives of local politicians and bank executives. Information was her primary currency. It was only a matter of time before Greg's barroom chatter found its way into her ledger. Greg boasted to a bartender about the geological anomaly out in Williams County. He mentioned the payout. He mentioned the seller, the Harris girl. That bartender happened to be the nephew of Barbara's favorite country club tennis partner. The breach happened 3 days before the anniversary dinner at the Oak Room. I left my leased acre early that afternoon. A freezing rain had turned the gravel roads to slick ice, cutting my soil testing short. I drove my Subaru back to my cramped apartment complex, eager for a hot shower and a quiet evening. The hallway on the 3rd floor smelled of old carpet and stale cooking oil. I reached for my doorknob, sliding my key into the lock. The metal cylinder was already turned. The door pushed open without resistance. A sharp scent hit my nose immediately. Chanel No. 5, my mother's signature perfume. I stepped inside, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. The apartment was dead quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. I walked down the narrow entry hall. My heart thudded a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I knew instantly that my sanctuary had been violated. Barbara sat at my small laminate kitchen table. She wore a tailored beige trench coat, pristine leather gloves resting next to a ceramic mug I kept on the counter. Spread out across the table was my mail. Years ago, I gave her a spare key during a severe plumbing emergency. She promised to put it in her home safe for emergencies. Instead, she had used it to bypass my front door and conduct a warrantless search of my life. She held a thick cream-colored envelope in her hands. It bore the embossed logo of my wealth management firm in Chicago. A junior associate at the firm had made a clerical error. Instead of routing my quarterly tax summary to the secure digital portal, they mailed a physical copy to my residential address. I stopped at the edge of the linoleum floor. I did not yell. I stared at the ripped envelope on the table. "Give me the key," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. Barbara did not flinch. She did not exhibit a single ounce of shame for breaking into my home and opening my private correspondence. She slowly lifted her head. Her features were pulled tight, her jaw set in a rigid line. Her eyes, usually masked by a practiced socialite charm, burned with a raw, ugly entitlement. "93 million, she whispered. The numbers tasted bitter in her mouth. She dropped the heavy cardstock onto the table. The crisp pages spilled out, exposing columns of astronomical figures, diversified trust accounts, and holding company ledgers. "You have $93 million, Barbara stated her pitch, rising with every syllable, "and you sit here in this squalor. You drive that pathetic vehicle. You let us think you are struggling." "You broke into my home," I replied, stepping closer to the table. "You opened federal mail. Both of those are crimes, Barbara. Put the key on the table and get out." She stood up. The wooden chair scraped harshly against the linoleum. Her pristine facade cracked, revealing the predator underneath. "How dare you speak to me about crimes?" she snapped. The veins in her neck strained against her pearl necklace. Her hands curled into tight fists at her sides. "Your sister is drowning in anxiety about her future. Bradley is working 80-hour weeks to provide for his family, and you are hoarding generational wealth in secret? You are a selfish, deceitful child." The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the stagnant air of the kitchen. She was not angry that I had lied. She was angry that she did not have access to the vault. Her concern for Stephanie was a weapon she swung to justify her own greed. "Generational wealth implies it belongs to a generation," I said, maintaining my quiet tone. "I earned this. I bought that land with my own wages. You called it a mud pit. William mocked me in front of our entire family." Her face flushed a deep mottled red. She slammed her palm onto the table, rattling the open envelopes. "I carried you for 9 months," she hissed, closing the distance between us until I could smell the mint on her breath. "We fed you, we clothed you, we paid for your braces, we shaped you into the woman who could secure a deal like this. This family built you, Rosalind. That money does not belong to you alone. It belongs to this family." Her twisted logic laid itself bare. In her mind, children were not independent humans. We were investments. We were extensions of her own ego. Because she had given birth to me, she felt a biological ownership over every dollar I would ever produce. Stephanie was the preferred investment, the daughter who followed the rules and married the flashy broker. I was the defective asset that had miraculously turned a profit. Now she intended to collect the dividend and redistribute it to her favorite child. If you are listening to this on Morning Revenge, let me ask you a question. Have you ever looked into the eyes of a parent and realized they do not see you as a person, but as a resource? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. I looked at the woman who raised me. I saw no maternal affection. I saw a creditor demanding payment for a debt I never agreed to owe. I reached across the table, grabbed her leather gloves, and shoved them against her chest. I did not break eye contact. "Leave the key," I instructed, "or I will call the police and have you escorted out of this building in handcuffs. Think about how that will look at your next charity gala." The threat of public embarrassment was the only weapon she truly respected. Her jaw clamped shut. She snatched the gloves from my hands. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out the silver house key, and tossed it onto the kitchen counter. It clattered against the laminate surface. "You cannot hide this from us, Rosalind," she warned, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper as she walked toward the front door. "We are your family. William is going to hear about this. We will not let you turn your back on your own blood." The heavy door slammed shut, rattling the cheap picture frames on my living room wall. I stood alone in the quiet apartment, staring at the financial documents scattered across my kitchen table. I knew the confrontation was not over. Barbara never retreated. She simply regrouped. I spent the next 3 days waiting for the fallout. I expected William to storm into my office. I expected a barrage of angry phone calls. Instead, there was nothing. Total silence. They were biding their time. They were planning the Oak Room Steakhouse dinner. They thought the social pressure of a public audience would break my resolve. They thought I would hand over $46 million to avoid a scene. They were wrong. But as I would soon discover, public humiliation was only their opening move. When I walked out of that steakhouse and drove away in the freezing snow, I thought I had won the battle. I did not realize William had spent those 3 quiet days preparing a much darker strategy. If they could not shame the money out of my hands, they were going to use the legal system to pry it from my cold, dead fingers. The fallout from the steakhouse did not arrive the next morning. It did not arrive the day after that. For 72 hours, my phone remained silent. No angry text messages from Barbara, no demanding voicemails from William. The quiet was worse than shouting. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a tornado, the kind of silence that makes the air feel too thick to breathe. They were not ignoring me. They were reloading. On Friday morning, the loud, rapid knocking at my apartment door pulled me away from my morning coffee. I looked through the peephole to see a postal worker shifting his weight in the freezing hallway corridor. He held a thick cardboard envelope and a digital signature pad. I unlocked the deadbolt, signed my name with a plastic stylus, and took the package. The cardboard was rigid, the edges sharp. I looked at the return address printed on the adhesive label. Sterling & Associates, a strip mall law firm located on the edge of town, sandwiched between a discount auto parts store and a dry cleaner. Leonard Sterling was a local attorney famous for putting his face on highway billboards. He handled messy divorces, slip-and-fall claims, and aggressive debt collection. He was a bottom feeder. William despised men like Leonard Sterling. My father managed a regional bank branch, dealing in crisp suits and high-end commercial loans. For William to hire a billboard lawyer meant he needed someone willing to operate in the gray areas of the legal system, someone who would not ask too many ethical questions. I carried the envelope to the same laminate kitchen table where my mother had invaded my privacy earlier that week. I used a butter knife to slice the thick cardboard open. A stack of legal documents slid onto the table. The cover letter was printed on cheap, textured paper. It stated that Leonard Sterling represented William and Barbara Harris in the matter of unpaid equity regarding the Williams County land sale. The letter demanded the immediate transfer of $46 million to an escrow account within 5 business days. If I failed to comply, the firm would file a civil lawsuit for breach of contract fraud and unjust enrichment. I stared at the words. Unjust enrichment. The sheer projection made my chest tight, but a threat from a strip mall lawyer was just ink on paper. Anyone can threaten to sue. You need proof to actually file a claim. I flipped to the second page. My breath caught in my throat. Attached as an exhibit was a 2-page document titled Seed Capital and Equity Sharing Agreement. The paper was dated 5 years ago, exactly 1 week before I closed on the 500 acres of dirt. The text outlined a private arrangement where William provided a $20,000 personal loan to help me secure the parcel. In exchange for this alleged financial rescue, the contract stated he was entitled to a 50% equity stake in the land and a half share of all future yields, sales, or mineral rights. At the bottom of the second page, resting right above a date line, was my signature. I traced the blue ink with my index finger. The loops were correct. The slant of the R and the sharp finish of the D were mine, but the pressure was wrong. The ink did not bite into the paper the way a pen does when a person writes naturally. It was too uniform. William had forged it. He was a career bank manager. He spent 40 years verifying signatures on commercial loans and mortgage applications. He knew exactly how to lift an old signature from a birthday card or a forgotten check and transpose it onto a fraudulent document. He had manufactured this contract the moment Barbara told him about my 9-figure bank statement. My father was not just an entitled parent anymore. He had crossed the hard, unyielding line into federal fraud. He was willing to risk prison to steal from his own child. I did not panic. I did not throw the papers across the room. I picked up my phone and dialed a Chicago area code. My attorney Evelyn answered on the second ring. Evelyn did not operate out of a strip mall. She occupied a corner office on the 50th floor of a downtown Chicago high-rise. She charged $2,000 an hour to shield the wealth of corporate executives and lottery winners. She was cold, surgical, and entirely immune to emotional family drama. I scanned the documents using my phone and uploaded the encrypted file to her secure server. We transitioned to a video call. Evelyn sat behind a sleek glass desk, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose as she reviewed the PDF. The silence on the line lasted for 3 excruciating minutes. I listened to the faint clicking of her mouse. "This is amateur hour," Rosalind Evelyn finally said, removing her glasses and looking directly into the camera lens. "The drafting of this contract is sloppy. The consideration clause is vague, and the signature transposition is evident even on a digital scan. A forensic handwriting expert will tear this apart in 30 seconds. "So we ignore it," I said, leaning back in my kitchen chair. "No," Evelyn replied, her tone sharpening. "We do not ignore it. The forgery is amateur, but the tactic is highly dangerous. Your father is a bank manager in a small capital city. I am willing to bet he plays golf with half the civil judges in your county." I nodded slowly. "He does." Evelyn folded her hands on her desk. "Leonard Sterling knows this contract will never survive a trial. That is not their goal. Their goal is an injunction. If they file this lawsuit, they will concurrently file a motion for a temporary restraining order on your assets. They will argue to a local judge that you are a flight risk or that you are hiding funds, and they will request that the entire $93 million be frozen in escrow until the dispute is resolved." A cold knot formed in my stomach. Can a judge actually do that based on a fake document? During the discovery phase, yes, Evelyn stated flatly. The judge only needs to see a plausible claim to freeze the disputed assets to prevent them from being spent. Discovery can take 6 months. It can take a year. During that time, your accounts are locked. You will not be able to transfer a single dime. You will be paralyzed. The strategy laid itself bare, brilliant and ruthless. William knew I still lived in my cheap apartment. He knew I still drove my beat-up Subaru. He assumed I was desperate to start spending my new wealth, eager to buy a mansion or travel the world. He was using the legal system to put a padlock on the gate of my new life. He believed that if he starved me out, if he kept the money just out of my reach, I would eventually cave and hand over the $46 million just to lift the freeze and access the rest. He was treating me like a hostage. "We need to counter this before they file," Evelyn advised her, eyes narrowing. "We can bury Leonard Sterling in retaliatory motions. We can threaten to refer your father to the federal authorities for wire fraud and forgery. I can draft a response that will make them regret ever buying a printer. Give me the green light, Rosalind." I looked at the forged signature on the kitchen table. I thought about the Thanksgiving dinner with the yellow rubber boots. I thought about Barbara breaking into my home. "Do not strike yet," I told Evelyn. She frowned. "Rosalind, if they file the injunction tomorrow morning, you are trapped." "They are not going to file tomorrow," I replied, trusting the dark instinct blooming in my chest. If William wanted to file, he would have done it without sending a warning letter. This is an extortion tactic. They want me to panic and wire the money today. But there is a missing piece here. "What missing piece?" Evelyn asked. "The desperation. William is arrogant, but he is a calculated banker. Forging a document is a desperate, reckless move that could end his career and cost him his pension. Why is he taking a risk this big? Why do they need exactly $46 million right now?" Evelyn watched me through the screen, her professional detachment softening into genuine intrigue. "You think there is a secondary motive?" "I think my family is hiding something much worse than a fake contract," I said. "Draft the retaliatory motions, Evelyn. Have them ready to file at a moment's notice, but hold the line. I need to know what they are running from before I drop the hammer." I ended the video call. I folded the sleazy demand letter back into its cardboard envelope and locked it inside my desk drawer. The emotional ties that bound me to William and Barbara severed completely in that moment. They were no longer my parents. They were hostile adversaries engaged in financial warfare. I put on my heavy winter coat, grabbed my car keys, and headed out the door to my consulting job. I needed to maintain my routine. I needed to act like a woman who was terrified of losing her secret fortune. But when I pulled into the parking lot of the agricultural firm an hour later, I realized my father was not the only one executing a strategy. Standing in the freezing wind by the glass lobby doors waiting for me was my sister. Stephanie was not wearing her usual country club smile. Her mascara was running down her cheeks, her designer coat was unbuttoned against the cold, and she looked like a woman standing on the edge of a very high cliff. The wind sweeping off the Dakota plains carried a bitter chill biting through the thick wool of my winter coat as I stepped out of the Subaru. I gathered my leather briefcase and locked the car doors, preparing for another mundane day of analyzing soil pH levels. My consulting firm occupied the second floor of a drab functional brick building on the commercial edge of Bismarck. It was a place characterized by fluorescent lighting, stale coffee, and quiet professionals. It was not a place built for theatrical family drama. Yet standing near the glass entrance doors, shivering in the freezing morning air, was my younger sister. Stephanie rarely ventured to this side of town. Her natural habitat consisted of high-end yoga studios, pristine country club dining rooms, and sprawling suburban cul-de-sacs. Whenever she graced a public space, she looked immaculate, wrapped in premium cashmere with every blonde hair sprayed into perfect submission. Today, the pristine facade was gone. Her camel-colored trench coat hung open, exposing a thin silk blouse that offered zero protection against the winter freeze. Her hair whipped wildly around her face. She held her phone in a tight, white-knuckled grip, pacing back and forth across the frosted concrete. She spotted me walking across the asphalt. Before I could even raise a hand in greeting, she broke into a run. The performance started before she reached me. A loud, ragged sob tore from her throat. She pushed through the heavy glass doors of the lobby just as I walked inside, using the enclosed space to amplify her distress. The lobby was a quiet, echoing space with a marble floor and a single reception desk. Carol, our veteran receptionist, paused with a stack of mail in her hands. Two junior agronomists waiting for the elevator turned around, their conversation dying instantly. Stephanie had secured her audience. She threw herself at me. Her hands grabbed the lapels of my coat, her fingers digging hard into the heavy fabric. She buried her face into my shoulder, unleashing a torrent of hysterical weeping. The scent of her expensive floral perfume washed over me, underscored by the sharp, sour tang of cold sweat. "Rosalind, please," she wailed, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "Please tell me you are not going to let this happen." I stood perfectly still. I did not wrap my arms around her. I let my briefcase hang heavy in my right hand. The social conditioning of our childhood dictated that I should comfort her, that I should absorb her pain and offer whatever she demanded to make the tears stop. I felt the familiar weight of the room pressing down on me. Carol was staring. The junior consultants were exchanging uncomfortable glances. Stephanie was using weaponized victimhood to publicly shame me into a corner. "I am standing right here, Stephanie," I said, keeping my tone flat and even. "Lower your voice." She did not lower her voice. She pulled back just enough to look me in the eye. Her face was a masterclass in manufactured tragedy. Dark mascara ran in thick, jagged lines down her pale cheeks. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, smearing expensive foundation across her knuckles. "How can you sleep at night?" she choked out, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. "How can you sit on tens of millions of dollars while your own family drowns? My girls are going to lose their home, Rosalind. Your nieces are going to be thrown out onto the street, and you are just standing there letting it happen." The gaslighting was breathtaking in its audacity. She painted a picture where my financial independence was a direct assault on her children. She framed my refusal to hand over a fortune as an act of calculated cruelty. I glanced down at my shoulder. A dark, oily smudge of black makeup stained the crisp white collar of my blouse, the physical mark of her manipulation. "You live in a gated community," I replied, lowering my voice so the spectators had to strain to hear. "You drive a luxury SUV. No one is throwing your children onto the street." "You do not understand the pressure," she pleaded, leaning in closer, her breath hitched in a practiced rhythm. "Bradley is carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He is a financial genius, Rosalind. You know he is brilliant. The market is just incredibly tight right now." I felt a cold, sharp spark of clarity ignite in my chest. I listened closely as the narrative shifted from securing a dream estate to bailing out a drowning man. "He just needs liquidity," Stephanie continued, the corporate buzzwords sounding foreign and desperate, falling from her trembling lips. "He has capital tied up in several commercial developments. He just needs a bridge loan to cover the gap. If he defaults on this one, margin call, the institutional lenders will trigger a cascade. They will seize everything, the business, the house, the savings accounts. We will be ruined. We just need the $46 million to stabilize his ledger." The dramatic irony of the moment was so thick I could practically taste it. She stood in a public lobby, ruining her designer clothes, begging for salvation while continuing to peddle the illusion of Bradley's superior intellect. She wanted me to believe he was a titan of industry suffering a temporary setback. But I spent my days analyzing data, identifying anomalies in complex systems, and studying root causes. I ran the numbers in my head while she continued to weep. Commercial real estate does not operate in overnight vacuums. A successful, diversified broker does not face personal annihilation over a single margin call unless he personally guaranteed a highly toxic debt. Furthermore, legitimate financial institutions do not demand an 8-figure cash injection over a weekend. If a licensed broker requires $46 million in liquid cash outside of standard banking channels, he is not dealing with banks. Bradley was not securing an estate, he was covering a crater. The puzzle pieces clicked together, forming a chilling picture. The forged contract from William, the aggressive demand letter from the strip mall lawyer, the sudden, frantic urgency. A legitimate businessman seeking a bridge loan offers equity collateral and a structured repayment plan. He does not send his father-in-law to forge signatures, and he does not send his wife to cry in a lobby. Bradley was not a genius facing a tight market. He was a fraud facing a reckoning. The tears streaming down my sister's face were genuine, but they were not born of familial betrayal. They were born of pure, unadulterated terror. She was begging me to take clean, legally obtained money and pour it into a black hole to save her husband from consequences she could not bear to name. I reached up and took hold of her wrists. Her skin was freezing cold. I peeled her fingers off my lapels one by one. I did not use force, but my grip was unyielding. I lowered her hands to her sides. "Listen to me very carefully," I said, leaning in until my mouth was inches from her ear. "I am not a venture capital firm. I am not a bailout fund, and I am certainly not foolish enough to hand an 8-figure check to a man who cannot balance his own ledger." Stephanie froze. The ragged sobbing stopped, instantly cut off, as if someone had flipped a switch. She stepped back. The fragile, desperate victim vanished. The mask slipped, revealing the raw, ugly resentment underneath. Her eyes narrowed into cold slits. For a fraction of a second, I saw the genuine hatred she harbored for me. The disgust that the sister she always viewed as inferior now held the keys to her salvation. "You are going to regret this," she whispered. Her voice was devoid of any sorrow. It was a flat, venomous promise. She turned on her heel, pushed through the glass lobby doors, and marched back out into the freezing wind, leaving a trail of heavy silence in her wake. I adjusted my coat, nodded politely to the wide-eyed receptionist, and walked toward the elevator. The conflict had fundamentally changed. This was no longer a petty dispute over family expectations or hurt feelings. I was no longer playing defense against greedy relatives. I was standing on the edge of a criminal conspiracy, and my family was trying to drag me into the dark with them. When the elevator doors closed, I pulled out my cell phone. I did not look at my schedule for soil testing. I opened a secure browser. I needed someone who operated in the shadows, someone who could dissect financial records, track hidden liabilities, and uncover the exact nature of the monster Bradley had become. I needed a professional. The steel doors of the elevator slid shut, cutting off my view of the lobby and the freezing morning beyond the glass. The quiet hum of the mechanical cables pulling the car upward was the only sound in the confined space. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. My hands were perfectly steady. The adrenaline that had flooded my veins during the confrontation with my sister was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I bypassed my contacts list and opened the secure messaging application my attorney had installed on my device. I typed a single brief sentence to Evelyn in Chicago. "I need a professional who hunts money," I wrote. Evelyn replied 3 minutes later with a phone number and a name. Victor Thorne. He was the founder of a premier corporate intelligence firm, a former federal investigator who spent 20 years dissecting the financial ruins of white-collar criminals. He did not handle cheating spouses or petty insurance fraud. He operated in the shadows of international banking, tracing ghost assets and untangling complex webs of corporate deceit. I called the number. A man with a low, gravelly voice answered on the first ring. I gave him Bradley's full legal name, his business address, and the names of his known corporate entities. I told Victor I needed a comprehensive autopsy of my brother-in-law's financial life, and I needed it faster than the legal deadline hanging over my head. "We require a substantial retainer for expedited intelligence," Victor stated, his tone devoid of any salesmanship. "Wire the invoice to Silver Sage Equities," I replied. "I want to know where every dollar originates and where every cent vanishes." The offensive had officially launched. I was no longer waiting for my family to strike. 2 days later, Victor flew into Bismarck. We did not meet in a corporate boardroom or a flashy restaurant. We met at a nondescript diner on the outskirts of town, sitting in a cracked vinyl booth near the back exit. The air smelled of burnt coffee and frying bacon. Victor blended perfectly into the rural landscape. He wore a faded flannel shirt and a dark canvas jacket, looking more like an off-duty mechanic than a man who commanded an elite team of forensic accountants. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He slid a thin manila folder across the sticky Formica table. "These are preliminary findings," Victor said, keeping his voice low as a waitress walked past with a pot of coffee. "Your brother-in-law is running a very busy ledger. He moves capital through a labyrinth of shell companies, but men like him always leave digital footprints in wet cement." I opened the folder. The top page displayed a convoluted flowchart connecting Bradley's commercial real estate firm to a series of obscure offshore accounts. "We tracked a pattern of recurring wire transfers," Victor explained, tapping a blunt fingernail against a specific box on the chart. "Every month for the past 2 years, $50,000 vanishes from his primary domestic operating account. It gets routed through a payment processor in Delaware, laundered through a holding company, and ultimately deposited into a private trust in the Cayman Islands. The trust is registered under the name Azure Holdings." I stared at the staggering numbers. $50,000 a month, $600,000 a year bleeding out of his supposedly thriving real estate empire into an island tax haven. "What is Azure Holdings?" I asked, tracing the black lines on the paper. Victor leaned back against the vinyl booth. "Usually a setup like this points to a parallel life, a secret second family, a mistress kept in a luxury condominium, or an extravagant vice that requires total anonymity. Bradley is siphoning cash away from his wife and his legitimate business partners to fund something he cannot afford to expose." The red herring swam to the surface, glittering and deceptive. It was the oldest cliché in the book. The arrogant, wealthy businessman funding a secret affair while his oblivious wife defended his honor in public lobbies. If Stephanie knew about Azure Holdings, the pristine country club facade she worshipped would shatter into a million pieces. But as I looked at the flowchart, the narrative felt incomplete. The pieces did not fit the current crisis. If he is just funding a mistress, I reasoned, keeping my eyes on the documents, why the sudden frantic desperation? A secret family requires a steady stream of income, not a $46 million overnight bailout. You do not forge legal documents and orchestrate public ambushes to pay rent on a secret condo. Victor offered a slow, grim nod. "That is the exact anomaly my team is tearing apart right now. A mistress is a slow leak. Your brother-in-law is acting like a man strapped to a ticking bomb. I will have the final unredacted dossier in 48 hours. Keep your head down until then." Keeping my head down became an impossibility the very next evening. My parents realized their strip mall legal threat had not provoked the immediate panic they anticipated. The silence drove them to escalate. They discarded their country club decorum and resorted to brute intimidation. It started at dusk. I was sitting in my cheap apartment reviewing soil data on my laptop. The heavy wooden front door rattled violently in its frame. The sound of fists pounding against the exterior echoed through the narrow hallway. "Rosalind," my father shouted, his voice muffled but furious through the cheap drywall. "Open this door right now! We know you are in there!" I closed my laptop. I did not move toward the entryway. I sat perfectly still in the dim light of the living room. "Do not ignore us," Barbara shrieked, her voice shrill and unhinged. "You are destroying this family. You are killing your sister. Open the door." The pounding intensified, vibrating the cheap picture frames on the wall. My neighbor across the hall shouted a threat to call the police. William yelled a string of obscenities back at the neighbor. The situation was spiraling into a public spectacle. They felt entirely justified terrorizing me in my own home because they still viewed me as property. They believed my physical boundaries were as non-existent as my financial ones. I realized my peace and my physical safety were permanently compromised. The old life was dead, and pretending to inhabit it was becoming a liability. I packed a single canvas duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, my laptop, and my secure documents. I waited until the hallway fell silent, until my parents finally retreated into the freezing night. Then I walked down the back stairwell, climbed into my Subaru, and left the complex for the last time. Wealth is a weapon, but it is also a shield. I decided it was time to deploy the shield. The next morning, I contacted a premium real estate broker who specialized in corporate relocation. I bypassed the standard leasing procedures and wired a full year of rent up front through Silver Sage Equities. By noon, I possessed the key fob to the top-floor penthouse of the most exclusive, high-security residential tower in downtown Bismarck. The contrast between my old reality and my new fortress was jarring. I stepped out of a private biometric elevator directly into a sprawling living space wrapped in floor-to-ceiling soundproof glass. The floors were heated hardwood. The kitchen featured imported marble and stainless steel appliances that had never been touched. The air was silent filtered and perfectly climate-controlled. Down below, the city of Bismarck looked like a miniature model covered in a dusting of white snow. The cars crawling along the frozen streets were tiny and insignificant. Up here, I was untouchable. There were 2 armed security guards stationed at the lobby desk. No one entered the building without my explicit digital authorization. William and Barbara could pound their fists against the reinforced glass of the ground floor all night, and I would never hear a single echo. I stood by the window, watching the sunset paint the winter sky in shades of bruised purple and dark orange. The ticking clock established by the strip mall attorney was growing louder. The deadline to wire the $46 million was approaching. The unhinged voicemails from my parents continued to flood my blocked caller inbox, shifting rapidly from furious demands to frantic, desperate begging. The pressure was mounting, but I felt nothing except cold anticipation. My cell phone vibrated on the marble kitchen island. The caller ID displayed Victor Thorne. I answered, looking out over the frozen river cutting through the city. "We cracked the shell company," Victor said. His low, gravelly voice lacked its usual steady cadence. It sounded tight. It sounded dangerous. "Is it a mistress?" I asked, watching a tiny plane trace a white line across the darkening sky. "No," Victor replied, the word dropping like a stone in the quiet penthouse. "It is not a mistress, Rosalind. Azure Holdings is a front for an offshore syndicate. We trace the ultimate beneficiaries. Your brother-in-law is not funding a secret life. He is drowning in blood money." The red herring dissolved, revealing the true monster lurking in the deep water. "I am boarding a flight to Bismarck right now," Victor continued, the background noise of an airport terminal bleeding through the speaker. "I have the final dossier. Do not answer any calls from your family. Do not let them near you. You have no idea who they are tied to." I ended the call. The soundproof glass of the penthouse kept the howling winter wind at bay, but the chill inside the room had nothing to do with the weather. The family drama had just evaporated, replaced by a criminal nightmare that threatened to pull all of us into the abyss. The biometric chime of the private elevator echoed through the quiet penthouse. The polished steel doors slid open, revealing Victor Thorne. He stepped onto the heated hardwood floor, looking entirely out of place in the pristine modern space. He wore the same faded canvas jacket and heavy boots, carrying a thick black leather briefcase that looked like it had survived a war zone. He did not offer a greeting. He walked directly to the broad marble kitchen island, unclasped the brass locks of his briefcase, and pulled out a heavy bound stack of paper. It was 50 pages thick, printed on crisp white stock. "This is the autopsy," Victor stated, his voice a low gravel rumble in the quiet room. He slid the dossier across the smooth stone surface. It stopped inches from my hands. "Your brother-in-law is a dead man walking, Rosalind." I looked down at the blank cover page. The city lights of Bismarck twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows behind me, indifferent to the destruction sitting on my counter. I opened the binder. The initial 10 pages detailed the internal ledgers of Bradley's commercial real estate firm. For years, he had marketed himself across the state as a visionary developer, a man who transformed empty lots into lucrative strip malls and high-end office parks. He attended charity galas, sponsored local golf tournaments, and drove cars that cost more than my first house. The truth buried beneath layers of fabricated tax returns and phantom holding companies was far less glamorous. Bradley was operating a textbook Ponzi scheme. He collected substantial escrow deposits from private investors, promising them early equity in multi-tenant commercial builds that never actually broke ground. When those initial investors demanded their quarterly dividend checks, he simply recruited a new batch of unsuspecting clients and used their fresh capital to pay the fabricated returns to the first group. It was a classic, desperate hustle. But a scheme of that nature requires a constant, aggressive influx of new cash to stay afloat. When the commercial property market cooled over the winter, the new investors stopped calling. The escrow accounts ran dry, the dividend checks started bouncing. "He has less than 30 days, Victor explained, pointing a thick finger at a highlighted column of numbers. The state financial auditors have scheduled a routine compliance review of his brokerage license for next month. When they open those escrow accounts and find empty air, they will issue federal indictments for wire fraud before the sun goes down." I traced the negative balances with my eyes. The deficit was staggering, but it did not explain the sheer visceral terror radiating from my sister in the lobby. Federal prison is a nightmare, but white-collar criminals rarely cry like they are facing a firing squad. "Turn to page 20, Victor instructed. I flipped the heavy pages. The second section of the dossier tracked the offshore syndicate. Azure Holdings was not a tax haven, and it was certainly not funding a mistress. It was a sophisticated collection agency for an underground sports betting and high-stakes gambling ring operating out of Eastern Europe. Bradley was not a brilliant financial strategist. He was a degenerate gambler with an ego that far exceeded his intellect. Victor reached across the island and tapped a glossy photograph clipped to the center of the stack. "Look at him." I unclipped the picture and held it up to the pendant lights. It was a grainy surveillance still, likely purchased from an informant or extracted from a compromised security feed. The timestamp indicated it was captured 3 weeks ago, inside a poorly lit basement room. Bradley sat at a green, felt-covered poker table. The country club facade was entirely stripped away. He wore his signature designer watch, but the luxury ended there. His tailored shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. His expensive silk tie hung loose and stained. His face was slick with a heavy, oily sweat. His eyes were wide dilated and locked onto the cards in front of him with raw, naked terror. Standing in the shadows behind his chair were 3 men. They did not wear tailored suits or country club smiles. They wore dark leather. They looked brutal, silent, and deadly. They were the kind of men who did not file civil lawsuits when a debt went unpaid. "He owes them $14 million, Victor said, watching my face process the information. They extended him a substantial line of credit based on his fraudulent real estate portfolio. When they realized the portfolio was garbage, they called the debt. They do not negotiate payment plans, Rosalind. They break kneecaps, they shatter orbital bones, and then they start targeting family members to secure their capital." I dropped the photograph onto the marble counter. The image of the sweating, terrified man felt like a heavy weight settling into my stomach. The $46 million ambush at the Oak Room Steakhouse suddenly snapped into brutal, crystal clarity. I ran the math in my head, the numbers falling into perfect alignment. $14 million to pay off the violent offshore syndicate and keep those men away from his front door, $10 million to quietly replace the stolen escrow funds before the state auditors arrived, allowing him to avoid federal prison. That left $22 million in liquid cash. He was never going to buy an estate for Stephanie, I said, the realization tasting like copper in my mouth. No, Victor agreed softly. He was going to secure international visas, purchase a remote, heavily fortified property in a non-extradition country, and disappear into the night before the dust settled. The true horror of my parents' demand washed over me. The demand letter from Leonard Sterling, the forged contract, the hysterical lobbying in the lobby. My family was actively trying to make me the fall guy for a collapsing criminal empire. If I had panicked, if I had transferred that $46 million into Bradley's accounts to make the harassment stop, the federal government would have eventually traced the capital. When the FBI dismantled his Ponzi scheme, they would follow the money straight back to Silver Sage Equities. I would have taken clean, heavily taxed, legally acquired wealth and pumped it directly into an international money laundering operation. I would have been indicted as an accessory to federal wire fraud. They were willing to sacrifice my freedom, my fortune, and my future to buy Bradley a ticket out of the country. They viewed me as an expendable asset, a sacrificial lamb to slaughter on the altar of the golden child's husband. The anger that had been simmering in my chest for 5 years crystallized into a cold, solid block of ice. I closed the section on Bradley and looked up at Victor. The fear was gone, replaced by an overwhelming surgical desire to dismantle their lives piece by piece. "We have everything we need to bury him," I said, my voice steady and hard. "I will send this directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission tomorrow morning. We will let the federal agents drag him out of his luxury SUV in handcuffs." Victor did not smile. He did not share my sense of impending victory. He placed his heavy, calloused hand on top of the closed binder. His dark eyes held a profound, quiet pity that made my skin crawl. "We are not finished, Rosalind," he said quietly. I frowned, looking down at his hand resting on the paper. What else could there possibly be? "You hired me to investigate the leak," Victor explained, "but you also asked me to find out why your father was desperate enough to forge a legal document. Bradley's debt explains his own desperation, but it does not explain why a conservative bank manager like William Harris would risk a felony conviction for his son-in-law." Victor lifted his hand and flipped the heavy stack of paper over to the third and final section of the dossier. I read the names printed at the top of the page: William and Barbara Harris. "You need to read this," Victor instructed, stepping back from the island and gesturing toward the documents. "Your brother-in-law is a criminal, but your parents are the architects of their own destruction." I looked down at the third section of the dossier resting on the marble island. The crisp white page bore the names William and Barbara Harris printed in bold black ink. My parents always projected an aura of impenetrable financial security. They drove leased luxury sedans, hosted lavish holiday parties, and scoffed at anyone who clipped coupons or drove domestic vehicles. I expected Victor to show me hidden brokerage accounts or secret trusts they planned to fill with my extorted wealth. I did not expect to see a foreclosure notice. I reached out and turned the page. The document beneath the cover sheet was a certified letter from a national mortgage lender. It detailed a crushing sequence of missed payments, late fees, and final warnings. "Look at the address," Victor said. His voice echoed faintly against the soundproof glass of the penthouse. I traced the printed text with my index finger. It was the colonial home on Elm Street, the sprawling, pristine estate where I grew up, the very house where William had dropped those yellow rubber boots onto my lap. For decades, that house served as the ultimate symbol of the Harris family prestige. It was their fortress of superiority. According to this ledger, I noted my throat feeling unusually dry. They took out a third mortgage 2 years ago. The principal is staggering. They leveraged the entire equity of the estate. Victor leaned against the edge of the kitchen counter. He crossed his arms over his canvas jacket. They did not just leverage the equity, Rosalind. They drained it dry. The bank is initiating the final auction proceedings in 60 days. Your parents are broke. They are drowning in debt, and they are about to lose the only asset they have left. The pieces of the puzzle shifted, forming a picture far more pathetic than simple greed. They were not demanding my money to elevate their status. They were demanding my money to survive. If Bradley went to prison, the entire financial ecosystem of our family would collapse. "But why did they take out a third mortgage to begin with?" I asked, turning to the next page in the stack. "William is a regional bank manager. He understands interest rates. He knows better than to bet his primary residence on a high-risk margin." "He knows better than to bet on a stranger," Victor corrected. "But he does not know better than to bet on the golden child. Look at the wire transfer records attached to the mortgage payout." I scanned the columns of numbers. 2 years ago, the exact day the third mortgage cleared, William transferred the entire lump sum directly into a corporate holding account controlled by Bradley. My parents had risked their home to bail my brother-in-law out of a previous financial disaster. They tied their survival to his success. When Bradley lost that money, he effectively signed their eviction notice. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the kitchen. I realized the true depth of their desperation. If the offshore syndicate destroyed Bradley William, and Barbara would be standing on the sidewalk with nothing but their designer luggage. I shook my head, feeling a strange mix of pity and disgust. They ruined themselves for him. Victor reached across the island and pulled a separate, thinner file from his leather briefcase. They did not just ruin themselves, Rosalind. They ruined you first. He placed the thin file on top of the foreclosure notice. The paper looked older, slightly yellowed around the edges. The date stamped in the upper right corner indicated the transaction occurred 10 years ago. I stared at the account number. It was a custodial savings account. It was my college fund. When I was in high school, my grandparents set aside a substantial trust specifically designated for my university tuition. It was meant to cover 4 years of out-of-state tuition, housing, and textbooks. I closed my eyes. The memories surfaced with vivid, agonizing clarity. 10 years ago, a month before my freshman semester, William called me into his home office. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and lemon furniture polish. He sat behind his heavy oak desk wearing a somber expression. He told me the market had suffered a severe downturn. He claimed the investments tied to my college fund had evaporated over the summer. He handed me a stack of federal student loan applications and told me that building character through hard work was the best education a person could receive. For the next decade, I worked double shifts at a local diner. I ruined my sleep schedule studying until dawn. I graduated with a mountain of predatory student debt that dictated every life choice I made, forcing me to live in cheap apartments and drive a failing Subaru just to meet the minimum monthly payments. I opened my eyes and looked at the banking records in front of me. The market did not crash, Victor stated quietly. Your father liquidated the custodial account. He drained every single cent. I felt a cold numbness spreading through my fingertips. Where did the money go? Victor pointed to a corresponding deposit slip clipped to the back of the ledger. 10 years ago, Bradley was just starting his career. He needed seed capital to launch his very first commercial real estate firm. Traditional banks refused to lend to him because he lacked collateral. He needed a private investor. William gave my college fund to Bradley. I whispered the words, scraping against my throat. He did, Victor confirmed. But the motive is the part that will keep you awake at night. Look at the personal checking records from the week prior to the liquidation. I flipped the page. I saw a cleared check written from Bradley to William in the amount of $5,000. 10 years ago, Victor explained, your father made a terrible speculative trade on his personal stock portfolio. He lost a significant amount of liquid cash. That same week, his annual country club membership dues were scheduled for automatic withdrawal. If the payment bounced, the club board would have suspended his membership. The gossip would have destroyed his social standing in Bismarck. He was going to bounce a check at the country club, I said, staring at the $5,000 deposit. Bradley found out, Victor continued. Bradley wrote him a personal check for $5,000 to cover the dues and save his pride. In exchange for that favor, in exchange for saving his ego in front of the local elite, your father handed Bradley the keys to your future. He took your tuition money, gifted it to his new favorite son-in-law as seed capital, and told you to sign your life away to federal loan providers. The numbness in my fingers vanished, replaced by a searing, white-hot clarity. William traded a decade of my life, my financial stability, and my youth for a $5,000 ego boost. He watched me struggle, he mocked my cheap boots, and he called me a failure, knowing full well he was the architect of my hardship. He built Bradley's empire using the bricks he stole from my foundation. Any lingering guilt I felt about withholding the $93 million burned away in that exact second. The societal conditioning that demanded I honor my parents dissolved into ash. They were not misguided family members. They were not victims of Bradley's manipulation. They were active, willing participants in my destruction. They were parasites who fed on my potential to sustain their own hollow vanity. I closed the thin folder. I smoothed my hand over the crisp cover, feeling the hard edges of the paper. Thank you, Victor, I said. My voice did not shake. It was perfectly level, stripped of all sorrow, and infused with a cold, calculated resolve. You have given me exactly what I need. Victor packed his briefcase in silence. He snapped the brass locks shut, offered a brief nod of acknowledgement, and walked toward the private elevator. The doors closed, leaving me alone in the sprawling, silent penthouse. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. The city below was dark, frozen, and unaware of the storm brewing inside the glass tower. I knew my next move. I was not just going to report them to the authorities. Handing a file to the federal government was too easy. They needed to believe they had won. They needed to sit in a room surrounded by their own arrogance and watch the doors lock behind them. I turned away from the window and walked back to the kitchen island. I needed to formulate a plan to draw them into a formal setting. Before I could reach for my laptop, the screen of my cell phone illuminated the marble counter. It did not display a blocked call from William or a text message from Stephanie. It was a notification from a social media application, then another, then 50 more. A rapid, incessant buzzing echoed through the quiet kitchen. The digital alerts piled up on the screen faster than I could read them. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. My mother had realized the legal threats and the physical intimidation had failed. Facing the ticking clock of foreclosure and federal indictment, the family had decided to go nuclear. They were pulling the trigger on a coordinated public execution, designed to shame me into submission before the entire world. The war had just shifted to a global stage, and the first shot hit me square in the chest. The digital onslaught began just past midnight. I stood in the center of my silent kitchen, the marble floor cold beneath my bare feet, watching the screen of my phone light up the dark room. It was a relentless rhythm of chimes, banners, and alert badges sliding across the glass. My mother understood that physical intimidation had failed the moment I vanished behind the biometric security of my new building. Faced with the ticking clock of foreclosure and federal prison, she pivoted to her most comfortable battlefield. She chose the court of public opinion. Barbara weaponized her social standing with surgical precision. She drafted a public post on her social media feeds tagging dozens of extended relatives, local business owners, and prominent members of her country club. She did not just write a complaint, she authored a manifesto of manufactured grief. I unlocked the device and opened the application. There, glaring back at me in stark black text, was a multi-paragraph essay painting me as a sociopathic monster. Barbara described my $93 million land sale in vivid detail, stripping away any right to privacy I thought I retained. She spun a narrative of a family that had sacrificed everything to lift up an ungrateful, troubled daughter. She claimed William and she had funded my education, supported my failing agricultural consulting business, and offered me nothing but unconditional love. According to her post, the moment I struck gold, I turned my back on the very people who built my foundation. But the core of her attack centered on Stephanie. Barbara painted a harrowing picture of a young mother facing ruin. She claimed Bradley was suffering a temporary market setback, and instead of offering a bridge loan, I was actively choosing to watch my nieces starve. She used phrases like heartless greed, pathological selfishness, and moral bankruptcy. She ended the post with a direct plea to the community. "Pray for Rosalind," she wrote. "Pray that she finds her soul before her greed destroys the only people who ever truly loved her." It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. By dawn, the post had garnered hundreds of reactions, comments, and shares. Bismarck is a small capital city where reputations dictate social currency. My mother had just declared me public enemy number one. The ripple effect was instantaneous. My phone transformed into a conduit for concentrated hatred. Relatives who had not spoken to me in 5 years flooded my inbox with vitriol. Uncle David sent a long text accusing me of spitting on my grandparents' legacy. Aunt Susan left a voicemail calling me a disgrace to the Harris name, her voice thick with self-righteous indignation. Cousins I barely recognized sent direct messages asking how I could sleep at night knowing my sister was suffering. They did not ask for my side of the story. They did not question why a supposedly wealthy real estate broker needed an emergency bailout. They simply absorbed the narrative my mother fed them, eager to tear down the family outcast who dared to achieve independence. The attack did not stop at family boundaries. By noon, the smear campaign spilled over into my professional life. Stephanie mobilized her network of suburban friends to target my consulting firm. My business page on various review platforms began hemorrhaging stars. Dozens of fake reviews materialized out of thin air. They claimed my soil analyses were fraudulent, stating my incorrect reports had ruined local crops. They insisted my professional conduct was unethical and my character was deeply flawed. They were trying to strangle my livelihood, hoping the economic pressure would force me to surrender. I sat on the edge of the plush sofa in my penthouse, watching the digital firestorm consume my reputation. The instinct to defend oneself is primal. Every nerve ending in my body screamed at me to type a response, to publish the forensic accounting dossier, to scream the truth about the embezzled college fund and the underground gambling syndicate. I wanted to post the photograph of a sweating Bradley sitting across from lethal offshore creditors. I wanted to watch their pristine country club facade burn to the ground. I did not type a single word. I maintained total radio silence. I called Evelyn in Chicago. She answered immediately, the sound of rapid typing echoing in the background of her office. "Are you reading the feeds?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "My paralegals are archiving every single keystroke," Evelyn replied. "We are taking screenshots, logging timestamps, and cataloging every defamatory statement. Your mother just handed us a textbook defamation lawsuit wrapped in a bow. The fake business reviews cross the threshold into tortious interference. We can sue her for civil damages that will eclipse the debt she owes the bank." "Do not send a cease and desist," I instructed. "Let them keep posting. Let them dig the hole as deep as they possibly can." Evelyn paused. The typing on her end stopped. "Most clients want the bleeding to stop, Rosalind. The social pressure you are enduring right now is designed to break human psychology. They want you to panic." "I am not panicking," I said, looking out the window at the snow-covered streets below. "I am watching them run out of time." The suffocating pressure of public hatred is difficult to describe unless you have survived it. For 3 days, I could not open a digital application without seeing my name dragged through the mud. I could not walk down to the lobby of my building without wondering if the concierge had read the local gossip forums. I became a pariah in my own hometown. The narrative was set. I was the wealthy villain, and my family was a group of tragic victims. Behind the glass walls of my fortress, I held the investigator's folder. I held the bank ledgers, the forged signature, the offshore wire transfers, and the truth about my stolen tuition. I held the power to destroy their entire lineage with a single click. Holding that power, while absorbing their relentless abuse, required a discipline I did not know I possessed. They thought my silence was cowardice. They thought I was hiding in shame, overwhelmed by the communal backlash. They posted updates claiming my lack of response was an admission of guilt. Bradley even went so far as to post a cryptic quote on his professional network about resilience in the face of familial betrayal. The sheer, staggering hypocrisy only hardened my resolve. They were dancing on a trap door, cheering for their own victory, entirely unaware that I held the lever in my hand. On the 4th day of the smear campaign, the tone of their private messages began to shift. The public bravado remained, but the direct texts from Barbara and Stephanie grew increasingly frantic. The insults morphed back into demands. They realized that ruining my reputation did not magically transfer $46 million into their checking accounts. The offshore syndicate was not going to accept social media likes as a form of payment. The state auditors were still scheduling their compliance review of Bradley's firm. The clock was striking midnight on their house of cards. They were out of leverage. They were out of ideas. They were cornered animals lashing out blindly in the dark. It was time to end the charade. I picked up my phone and called Evelyn back. The strategy phase was over. We needed to move into execution. "Draft a formal communication to Leonard Sterling," I told my attorney. "Tell him the public pressure has become too much to bear. Tell him I am ready to concede." Evelyn let out a low, sharp breath. "You are initiating the trap." "Yes," I said, walking over to the marble kitchen island and placing my hand flat against the leather cover of Victor's dossier. "Tell them I am willing to negotiate a multi-million-dollar settlement to make this all go away. But there are conditions. It cannot be done over email. I want a formal in-person mediation session. I want William, Barbara, Stephanie, and Bradley in the same room." "I will set the terms," Evelyn confirmed, her voice thick with anticipation. "They will think they broke you." "They need to believe they won," I replied. "Let them walk into that room feeling victorious. I want them to taste the money before I pull the floor out from under them." I hung up the phone. The smear campaign was about to conclude not with an online rebuttal, but with a face-to-face reckoning. I was going to let them sit across a mahogany table, surrounded by their own arrogance, and hand them the final bill for everything they had stolen. The email departed from Evelyn's outbox precisely at 9 in the morning. It was a masterpiece of legal theater, crafted to project total defeat. My attorney contacted Leonard Sterling with a message that surrendered every ounce of leverage we held. The correspondence stated that my client was deeply overwhelmed by the mounting community backlash. It claimed the emotional toll of the family dispute had become too heavy a burden to carry. Therefore, to preserve the Harris family name and restore domestic harmony, Rosalind was prepared to negotiate a substantial 8-figure financial settlement. We requested an immediate private mediation session to finalize the transfer of funds. We specified that the meeting must occur in person, in a neutral corporate environment with all primary parties present. William, Barbara, Stephanie, and Bradley had to attend. The bait was cast into the dark water. We did not have to wait long for a strike. Leonard Sterling called Evelyn less than 10 minutes after the email cleared his server. According to Evelyn, the strip mall lawyer sounded breathless. He was practically vibrating with the anticipation of securing a cut of a $46 million payout. Sterling eagerly agreed to our terms, waiving the standard preliminary disclosures to expedite the sit-down. They were so blinded by their own greed and the ticking clock of their respective financial disasters that they did not question why I was suddenly offering a fortune without a fight. If you are listening to this on Morning Revenge, you already know that the most dangerous opponent is the one who suddenly stops fighting back. Predators rely on resistance to gauge their dominance. When the resistance vanishes, they assume victory. Make sure you follow the channel, because learning how to lay a silent trap is the most valuable skill you will ever acquire. The immediate consequence of Evelyn's email was a sudden, eerie silence on the digital front. The vicious social media smear campaign halted in its tracks. Barbara stopped posting multi-paragraph essays about my moral bankruptcy. The influx of fake reviews on my consulting page dried up instantly. They had achieved their goal. They had bullied the ungrateful daughter into submission, and continuing the public execution served no further purpose. They needed to clean up their image before collecting the check. I sat at the marble island in my penthouse, watching the snow fall over the frozen river outside my window. My phone, which had been a relentless source of anxiety and hatred for nearly a week, sat quietly on the counter. Then the screen illuminated. A single text message pushed through the lock screen. It was from Stephanie. "I knew you would finally do the right thing for this family," the message read. I stared at the glowing letters. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of that sentence encapsulated everything wrong with my sister. She was not expressing relief that her husband might avoid federal prison. She was not thanking me for supposedly saving her children from eviction. She was asserting dominance. She was taking a victory lap. In her mind, she had successfully disciplined a disobedient subordinate. She believed the natural order of our family dynamic was restored. The golden child requested a sacrifice, and the scapegoat was finally marching to the altar. I did not reply. I locked the screen and slid the device into my pocket. Let her savor the delusion. The higher they built their pedestal of unearned triumph, the harder the concrete would feel when I shattered the supports. The pacing of my life slowed down to a deliberate surgical crawl. The frantic energy of the past few weeks dissolved, replaced by the cold, meticulous preparation of a surgeon arranging instruments on a steel tray. Evelyn flew into Bismarck the following afternoon. She bypassed the cheap motels near the highway and arrived directly at my high-security residential tower. She brought a junior paralegal with her, carrying 3 heavy leather briefcases. An hour later, Victor Thorne arrived. The former federal investigator walked into my living room, shaking the snow from his heavy canvas coat. My dining table transformed into a war room. The 3 of us stood around the polished mahogany, assembling the weapon that would dismantle the Harris family legacy. We did not need digital presentations or flashy legal jargon. We needed raw, undeniable paper. Victor placed a thick black leather folder in the center of the table. Inside were the original forensic documents. We organized them with lethal precision. The first tab contained the bank ledgers proving Bradley's Ponzi scheme and the empty escrow accounts. The second tab held the offshore wire transfers to the violent underground gambling syndicate, complete with the surveillance photograph of Bradley sweating at the poker table. The third tab contained the certified foreclosure notices for my parents' colonial estate. Evelyn reached into her briefcase and produced the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. She placed the forged cosigner agreement directly next to the banking records. "When you slide this folder across the table," Victor said, his gravelly voice echoing in the quiet room, "you must anticipate a volatile reaction. Cornered animals do not act rationally. Bradley is facing lethal offshore creditors and federal indictments. When you strip away his only escape route, he will not apologize, he will attack." "I am counting on it," I replied. Evelyn reviewed the seating chart for the mediation room we had rented at a premium downtown firm. We controlled the environment. We dictated where William would sit, where Stephanie would sit, and exactly how close Bradley would be to the center of the table. We mapped the exits. We coordinated the timing of the document reveal. It was not a negotiation. It was an ambush, dressed in a tailored suit. By early evening, the preparation was complete. Evelyn and Victor retreated to their respective accommodations to prepare for the morning. I was left alone in the sprawling, silent penthouse. I needed one final item. It was not a legal document, and it was not a financial ledger. It was a prop. I put on my heavy winter coat, walked to the private elevator, and descended to the secure garage. I drove my 10-year-old Subaru out into the freezing Dakota night. I bypassed the high-end wine merchants in the affluent commercial district and drove toward the edge of town, pulling into the flickering fluorescent glow of a rundown gas station. The bell above the glass door chimed as I walked inside. The air smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. I walked to the back aisle, scanning the bottom shelf of the beverage cooler. I found exactly what I was looking for. A $10 bottle of Pinot Grigio with a metal screw cap and a slightly peeling label. I carried the cheap bottle to the counter and paid the cashier with a crumpled $20 bill. I did not care about the change. I walked back to my car, gripping the cold glass neck of the bottle. This was the exact brand of wine I drank sitting in the dark of my cramped apartment the night the $93 million hit my bank account. It was a grounding mechanism. It was a tangible reminder of the woman who survived their mockery, the woman who worked double shifts to pay off predatory student loans while her father gifted her tuition to a fraudster. Bringing this cheap gas station wine into a room full of people who measured human worth in luxury brands was the ultimate sign of disrespect. It was my way of telling them their pristine country club rules no longer applied to me. I owned the board, and I was about to flip the table. I returned to the penthouse and placed the bottle next to the heavy black folder on my kitchen island. I spent the final hours of the night standing by the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the sleeping city of Bismarck. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the streets coated in a thick, undisturbed layer of white ice. The world looked peaceful, frozen, and entirely still. It was the eerie, suffocating calm before a massive storm. My parents were likely sleeping soundly in their colonial home, dreaming of the financial salvation they believed they had secured. Stephanie was probably planning renovations for her non-existent estate. Bradley was undoubtedly counting the hours until he could wire stolen funds to a Cayman Island trust and book a one-way flight out of the country. They thought tomorrow was their coronation. They had no idea they were walking directly into an execution chamber. I turned away from the window, walked to the kitchen island, and rested my hand on the cold leather of the black folder. The trap was set, the bait was swallowed. All that remained was waiting for the sun to rise, walking into that glass-walled room, and snapping the steel jaws shut. If you are just joining this story on Morning Revenge, make sure you hit the subscribe button. We have reached the mediation room the exact moment the trap snaps shut. Learning how to navigate a room full of predators is a vital skill, and I want to share every detail of this reckoning with you. The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Evelyn secured a sprawling, glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of a prestigious downtown law firm. The space was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the frozen capital city. The sky was a pale, bruised gray, promising another blizzard. A heavy mahogany table anchored the center of the room, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs. I arrived an hour early. I sat on one side of the wide table, flanked by Evelyn on my left and Victor Thorne on my right. We resembled a silent tribunal waiting for the accused to arrive. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy oak doors clicked open. The Harris family walked inside. They did not walk like people who had just spent a week terrorizing their own flesh and blood. They walked like conquering royalty. They projected an aura of triumphant entitlement, believing they had successfully bullied me into surrendering a fortune. William led the pack. He wore a tailored navy suit, carrying his shoulders high, his chin thrust forward in a posture of patriarchal authority. Barbara followed close behind, draped in a camel cashmere coat. She carried a designer handbag and wore an expression of practiced, dignified suffering, playing the role of the wounded mother, ready to forgive her wayward child for a price. Stephanie walked in wearing a pristine white wool dress. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, erasing any trace of the hysterical woman who had ruined my blouse in the office lobby a week prior. She looked around the expensive conference room with hungry eyes, already calculating how she would spend the settlement. Bradley brought up the rear. The terrified, sweating gambler from the surveillance photograph was gone. He wore a crisp charcoal blazer, a silk tie, and a luxury watch that caught the overhead lights. He practically vibrated with profound relief. He walked with the swagger of a man who believed he had just cheated death. He pulled a heavy leather chair out for his wife, patted her shoulder, and then took his own seat, directly across from me. He flashed a brief predatory grin, a silent acknowledgement of his supposed victory. Leonard Sterling, the strip mall attorney, followed them into the room. He looked nervous, clearly out of his depth in the high-end corporate environment, but eager to secure his percentage of the payout. He set his scuffed briefcase on the polished mahogany. He unclasped the brass buckles. The sharp snap echoed off the thick glass walls, breaking the heavy silence. Sterling cleared his throat and pulled out a crisp stack of legal documents. He slid the thick packet across the wide table. The paper stopped right in front of Evelyn. The top page displayed a bold, capitalized title indicating a binding settlement agreement for the sum of $46 million. My clients are pleased we could resolve this unfortunate family matter without court intervention, Sterling began. His voice was slick with false diplomacy echoing in the quiet room. If you sign the final page, we can initiate the wire transfer and put this ugly chapter behind everyone. I did not look at the paper. I did not acknowledge the lawyer. I kept my gaze locked on the 4 members of my family sitting across the table. They watched me with eager anticipation. Stephanie tapped her manicured fingernails against the leather armrest, telegraphing her impatience. William crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for me to pick up a pen and concede defeat. I reached down to the canvas bag resting at my feet. I did not pull out a luxury fountain pen. I pulled out the bottle of cheap gas station Pinot Grigio. I set the bottle on the expensive mahogany. The dull thud drew every eye at the table. The peeling label faced the room, a stark contrast to the polished environment. William frowned, his thick brows pulled together in deep confusion. "Rosalind, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice thick with irritation. I ignored him. I reached into my bag a second time and produced a plain glass tumbler. I set it next to the wine. I wrapped my fingers around the metal screw cap. The sharp mechanical crack of the seal breaking sounded like a firecracker in the dead silence of the conference room. Barbara opened her mouth to speak, likely preparing to scold me for bringing cheap alcohol into a formal legal proceeding. Before she could form the words, I poured the pale liquid into the tumbler. The splashing noise filled the quiet air. I set the bottle down, picked up the glass, and took a slow sip. The tart, acidic flavor burned the back of my throat, anchoring me to the reality of the moment. It tasted exactly like independence. I lowered the glass. I bypassed my parents. I ignored my sister. I looked directly into the eyes of the man who thought he had orchestrated the perfect escape. "Bradley," I said. My voice was quiet, stripped of any emotion, echoing off the cold glass panes. "You are a highly successful commercial real estate broker. You develop strip malls. You manage multi-tenant office parks. You drive a $100,000 vehicle." Bradley shifted in his heavy leather chair. The predatory grin faltered, replaced by a tight, artificial smile. He glanced at William, then back to me. He adjusted his silk tie, clearing his throat. "I am glad you recognize the value of my work, Rosalind," he replied, attempting to inject a tone of arrogant confidence into the room. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. I do recognize it, which brings me to a mathematical problem I have been trying to solve all week. Tell me, why does a supposedly brilliant liquid and thriving financial mogul desperately need $46 million in cash by Friday? The artificial smile vanished from his face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. The vibration of relief ceased instantly, replaced by a sudden, rigid paralysis. He stared at me, his jaw working as if he had forgotten how to form words. The swagger evaporated into thin air. Stephanie turned her head to look at her husband, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Rosalind, what are you talking about?" she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "We explained this. The market is tight. He needs a bridge loan to cover a margin call." I did not look at Stephanie. I kept my eyes pinned on her husband, watching the panic begin to crack his polished exterior. "A bridge loan requires collateral," I stated, the words dropping like heavy stones onto the table. "A margin call requires a financial audit. You did not offer collateral. You sent your father-in-law to forge my signature on a fraudulent contract. You sent your wife to cry in a public lobby. You threatened to destroy my reputation." Leonard Sterling realized the narrative was slipping out of his control. He placed a hand flat on the table, trying to reassert his authority. "Miss Harris, we are not here to interrogate my client. We are here to sign a settlement agreement. If you refuse to sign the paperwork, we will file the injunction before the courthouse closes today." Evelyn leaned forward. She did not raise her voice, but her tone commanded the entire room. "You will not file anything, Mr. Sterling. You will sit quietly and listen, because your clients lied to you and they are about to make you an accessory to federal crimes." Sterling pulled his hand back as if the mahogany had burned his skin. He looked at Bradley, then at William, his legal instincts warning him that he had walked into a trap. William stood up. His face flushed a deep, angry red. "I will not tolerate this disrespect," my father barked, pointing a thick finger at me across the table. "We came here in good faith to accept your apology and resolve this dispute. Sign the paper, Rosalind, or we walk out that door right now and let the judge freeze your accounts." "Sit down," William Victor Thorne said. It was the first time the former federal investigator had spoken. The gravelly, unyielding authority in his voice hit my father like a physical blow. William hesitated. He looked at the broad-shouldered man sitting next to me, realizing for the first time that I had not brought a random paralegal to the meeting. Slowly, reluctantly, the fight drained out of my father and he sank back into his leather chair. The room belonged to me. The silence stretched thin and brittle, ready to snap under the weight of the unspoken truths. I took another sip of the cheap wine. Bradley was sweating now. A thin bead of moisture tracked down his pale forehead, perfectly mirroring the surveillance photograph hidden inside my bag. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He knew the charade was over. "You are not going to walk out that door," I told my family, setting the tumbler down on the polished wood, "because nobody is leaving this room until we review the real paperwork." I reached down one final time. I bypassed the canvas bag. I placed my hands on the heavy black leather folder resting on my lap, preparing to drag every single one of their secrets out into the freezing daylight. Welcome back to Morning Revenge. If you are just joining this narrative, hit that subscribe button to follow the channel. We are currently sitting inside a freezing, glass-walled conference room, and the execution is about to begin. I lifted the heavy leather-bound folder from my lap. It landed on the polished mahogany with a dull, final thud. I placed my palm flat against the dark cover and pushed. The binder slid across the smooth wood, gliding over the reflection of the overhead fluorescent lights, and came to a halt exactly 1 inch from Bradley's resting fingertips. "Open it," I instructed. My tone carried no heat. It was clinical, detached, the voice of a surgeon examining a fatal wound. Bradley stared at the black leather as if it contained a live explosive. He looked at William for guidance. My father puffed out his chest, attempting to maintain his crumbling patriarchal authority. "This is a bluff," William scoffed, waving a dismissive hand through the air. "She is trying to derail the settlement process to save a fraction of her payout. Open the file, Bradley, and let us get this circus over with." Bradley possessed shaking hands. His manicured fingers fumbled with the edge of the stiff cover. He flipped it open. The first page displayed the internal operating ledger of his commercial real estate firm, meticulously cross-referenced with his empty escrow accounts. I watched his eyes dart across the columns of numbers. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving his skin a terrifying shade of translucent gray. "Those are your domestic accounts," I explained, keeping my voice loud enough for the entire room to absorb. "The ones you drained to pay early investors in your real estate Ponzi scheme. The state financial auditors are scheduled to review those exact ledgers next month. They will find empty air, and they will issue federal indictments for wire fraud before the sun sets." Stephanie leaned over to look at the paper, her brow knit in profound confusion. "Bradley, what is she talking about?" she whispered. "What empty accounts?" "Turn to the next tab," I ordered. Bradley did not move. He sat, paralyzed, his breathing shallow and rapid, his chest rising in sharp, erratic bursts. I stood up, leaned across the wide table, and flipped the heavy cardboard divider myself. The glossy surveillance photograph stared up at the ceiling. The image captured Bradley sweating profusely in a dimly lit basement surrounded by lethal enforcers. Attached beneath the photo were the offshore wire transfer receipts routing his capital to Azure Holdings. "Your husband is not suffering a market setback, Stephanie," I said, shifting my gaze to my sister. "Your husband is a degenerate gambler who owes $14 million to a vicious international betting syndicate. They called his debt. They are hunting him. He demanded my land sale profits to pay them off, replenish the stolen escrow funds, and flee the state before the federal government arrives at your doorstep." Stephanie let out a sharp, choked gasp. She recoiled from the table, pressing her spine against the back of her leather chair. She stared at the photograph of her husband in the underground poker room. The pristine country club illusion shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of her eyes. She looked at the man she married as if he were a stranger wearing a familiar mask. Bradley opened his mouth. A dry clicking sound emerged before he found his voice. "These are fabricated," he stammered, looking frantically at Leonard Sterling. "She manufactured these documents to avoid paying the agreed settlement." Victor Thorne shifted in his seat. "I did not manufacture anything so," the former investigator rumbled. "I pulled those routing numbers directly from the Cayman Island registry. You are a dead man walking." William stood up. His chair scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. "This is absurd," my father shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Victor. "We are leaving. I will not subject my family to this slander." "You are not going anywhere, William," I stated, turning my focus to the patriarch of the Harris family, "because we need to discuss your primary residence." I reached across the table and flipped to the third section of the binder. The certified foreclosure notice sat on top of the pile, stark and undeniable. Barbara let out a soft, wounded noise. Her hands flew to her mouth. The dignified, suffering mother routine vanished, replaced by genuine, naked panic. Her eyes darted wildly between the document and her husband. "You took out a third mortgage to bail your golden son-in-law out of a previous disaster 2 years ago," I announced, addressing the room. "You tied your financial survival to a fraudster. The bank is auctioning your colonial estate in 60 days. You are broke. You demanded my money because if Bradley goes to prison, you end up sleeping on the sidewalk." The atmosphere in the room turned toxic. The air felt heavy, suffocating under the weight of their exposed failures. William sank back into his chair. His shoulders slumped forward. The arrogant banker was gone, replaced by a terrified, ruined old man, facing the destruction of his legacy. "But that is not the worst part," I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh, quiet whisper. "The worst part is what you did 10 years ago." I pulled the final manila envelope from my canvas bag. I untied the string closure and slid the aged, yellowing bank statements onto the table. I tapped the paper with my index finger. I looked at William. I watched the recognition spark in his eyes, followed quickly by a profound, hollow dread. He knew exactly what paper rested beneath my hand. 10 years ago, you drained my custodial college fund," I said. "You stole 4 years of university tuition from your own daughter. You handed that seed capital to Bradley so he could launch his very first fraudulent business. And you did it all because he wrote you a personal check for $5,000 to cover your bouncing country club dues. You traded a decade of my youth, my financial stability, and my trust to save your fragile ego at a local golf course." Silence descended on the conference room. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the ringing, deafening silence of a bomb detonating in an enclosed space. Stephanie stared at our father in horror. Even she, the favored child, seemed physically repulsed by the sheer depth of his betrayal. She realized her perfect life was built on a foundation of stolen money. Barbara began to tremble. Her hands shook visibly in her lap. She looked at the foreclosure notice, then at the stolen college fund ledger, and finally at her golden son-in-law sitting paralyzed in his chair. Her entire worldview was collapsing around her ears. I reached into my bag one last time. I pulled out the fraudulent demand letter and the forged cosigner agreement William had manufactured earlier that week. I placed the forgery directly next to the bank statements proving Bradley stole from his commercial clients. I looked at my trembling mother. I did not feel pity. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a closed circle. "You bet your entire life on the wrong horse," I told her, my words cutting through the stagnant air. "And now you want me to pay for the glue?" Leonard Sterling, the strip mall attorney, had remained silent during the entire presentation. He stared at the forged cosigner agreement resting on the mahogany table. He looked at the offshore wire transfers. He realized he was not sitting in a petty family dispute. He was sitting in the middle of a federal conspiracy, and his clients had used his legal letterhead to orchestrate an extortion attempt. The liability was staggering. Sterling stood up. He did not say a word to William. He did not look at Bradley. He grabbed his scuffed briefcase and frantically shoved his blank settlement papers inside. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped an expensive pen onto the floor. He ignored it, leaving it rolling across the carpet. "I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel," Sterling announced, his voice cracking under the strain. "Do not contact my office. Do not use my name. This meeting is over." He turned and practically ran toward the heavy oak doors, pulling them open and disappearing into the hallway. The click of the latch sealing the room sounded like a vault locking shut. My family sat frozen in their chairs. They were stripped of their lawyer, their leverage, and their dignity. They had walked into the room expecting a coronation, and they were leaving it with a death sentence. But cornered animals do not surrender peacefully. When you strip away a predator's final escape route, survival instinct overrides logic. Bradley looked at the evidence scattered across the table. His chest heaved. The terror in his eyes morphed into something entirely different. It morphed into pure, unhinged rage. The true monster was about to break off its leash, and I was sitting directly in its path. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind Leonard Sterling, sealing the five of us inside the glass-walled conference room. The click resonated through the stagnant air, a final, definitive sound that signaled the end of the legal charade. The silence that followed was suffocating. It pressed against my eardrums, thick with unspoken dread and the sharp tang of adrenaline. Nature abhors a vacuum, and in that high-rise boardroom, Bradley rushed to fill it. The transition from a polished, arrogant broker into a cornered feral animal occurred in the blink of an eye. Bradley stood up. He moved with such sudden erratic force that his heavy leather armchair tipped backward. It crashed against the floor-to-ceiling window with a deafening thud. The impact rattled the thick panes, sending a shudder through the floorboards. His breathing grew ragged, his chest heaving under his tailored charcoal blazer. The slick corporate mask melted away, exposing the raw terror and indignation underneath. He planted both of his hands on the edge of the mahogany table. His knuckles turned bone white. He did not retreat. He did not apologize for stealing his client's money or jeopardizing my parents' home. When a predator loses its escape route, survival instinct dictates a blind, relentless attack. He vaulted forward. He threw his upper body across the wide expanse of polished wood, scattering the crisp pages of his fraudulent settlement agreement. His forearm clipped a tall glass pitcher of ice water resting in the center of the table. The pitcher tipped and shattered. Sharp shards of crystal exploded across the mahogany. Freezing water surged in a chaotic wave, soaking into the forged cosigner document and blurring the ink on William's manufactured signature. Bradley ignored the mess. He leaned into my personal space until I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sour, metallic odor of his panic. "You think you are so smart," he hissed, a fine mist of spit flying from his lips. "You sit there with your cheap wine and your little folders, acting like you hold all the cards. You think you can just walk in here and ruin my life?" I did not flinch. I did not pull back. I maintained steady, unyielding eye contact. I ruined nothing, Bradley. You built a house out of matches and handed the syndicate a flamethrower. He slammed his fist into a puddle of spilled water. The crack echoed off the glass walls. I built an empire, he roared, the veins in his neck straining against his silk collar. I hit a temporary roadblock. I can fix it, but I need capital. And you are going to provide it. You owe this family. You will wire $46 million into a secure transit account by noon today. His eyes widened, the pupils dilating into dark, empty pools. He was no longer trying to negotiate. He was drafting a blueprint for mutual destruction. If you refuse, he continued, his voice dropping into a guttural, menacing growl, I swear to God, Rosalind, I will drag you into the abyss with me. I know how the federal authorities operate. I know how to manipulate a paper trail. When the state auditors raid my office, I will tell the Securities and Exchange Commission that Silver Sage Equities is a front. I will swear under oath that you used your land buyout to finance the Cayman Island trusts. Stephanie gasped, a sharp intake of air that went entirely ignored by her husband. He was fixated on me pouring his desperate venom directly into my face. I will forge the digital footprints Bradley promised, a manic, breathless edge creeping into his tone. I will link your pristine Chicago accounts to the underground syndicate. The FBI will freeze your $93 million before the end of the week. You will spend the next 10 years rotting in a federal holding cell, fighting a money laundering indictment, while your precious agricultural foundation turns to ash. You wire the funds right now, or you burn with me. He stopped speaking, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow bursts. He waited for the fear to set in. He expected me to pale, to tremble, to beg for a compromise. He believed his threat was the ultimate trump card. I looked at the drops of water clinging to his expensive tie. I felt the steady, measured beat of my own heart. I did not feel fear. I felt a profound, chilling sense of victory. I reached past the shattered crystal and picked up my plain glass tumbler. The pale Pinot Grigio swirled gently inside. I brought the rim to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The tart, acidic flavor washed over my tongue, clearing the bitter taste of his desperation. I lowered the glass. A slow, quiet smile spread across my face. You should have kept your mouth shut, I whispered. I raised my right hand. I did not point at his sweating face. I extended my index finger and pointed down, aiming directly at the center of the mahogany table, right next to Evelyn's yellow legal pad. Resting inconspicuously on the dark wood was a sleek obsidian cylinder. It looked like a high-end fountain pen, the kind a corporate attorney might use to sign a multi-million-dollar contract. But at the very top of the black casing, a microscopic LED light pulsed. It flashed in a steady, rhythmic, bright red heartbeat. Bradley's gaze followed my finger. He stared at the blinking light. The pharaoh rage in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden, hollow realization. North Dakota is a single-party consent state regarding the recording of private conversations, Evelyn stated. My attorney did not raise her voice. She spoke with the clinical, detached precision of a judge handing down a terminal sentence. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked at the man leaning across the table. Mr. Harris, you have just articulated a premeditated extortion attempt, Evelyn continued. You explicitly detailed a plan to commit perjury, falsify federal documents, and blackmail my client for 8 figures. You threatened to obstruct a federal investigation by fabricating evidence against an innocent party. Bradley opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He pushed himself off the table, stumbling backward until his knees hit the edge of his overturned chair. He looked at the blinking red light as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the mahogany. As an officer of the court, Evelyn explained, folding her hands neatly over her legal pad, I am bound by strict ethical obligations. When a party presents a credible, recorded threat to commit federal fraud and extort my client, I no longer have a choice in the matter. I am legally mandated to forward this unedited, high-definition audio file directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Enforcement Division of the SEC. The trap snapped shut, breaking the spine of their entire conspiracy. Stephanie unleashed a sound I will never forget. It was not a cry of sorrow. It was a harrowing, guttural scream of pure, unadulterated terror. The final delusion shattered. The man she married had just handed the federal government a pristine, airtight confession to a catalog of felonies. There was no spinning the narrative, there was no bridge loan, there was only the impending reality of prison bars and asset seizures. She covered her ears with her hands, pressing her forehead against the edge of the table, sobbing hysterically into the spilled ice water. William grasped his chest. His posture crumbled, his spine curving as the invisible weight of his choices crashed down upon him. His face turned a sickly ashen gray. The proud, arrogant bank manager dissolved into a terrified old man. He knew his legacy was dead. He knew his colonial estate was gone. He realized he had sold his eldest daughter's future to a degenerate gambler who just dug their collective grave on a recorded line. He slumped sideways in his chair, gasping for air, unable to look me in the eye. Barbara did not scream, she did not yell. She placed her elbows on her armrests and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent, agonizing tremors. The matriarch of the Harris family, the woman who commanded country club galas and dictated social hierarchies, was reduced to a weeping, broken shell. She mourned her lost empire. She mourned the designer clothes she would have to sell the friends who would turn their backs on her, and the public humiliation that would soon plaster the front page of the local newspaper. I stood up. I smoothed the wrinkles from my skirt and picked up my canvas bag. The initial forensic dossier is already in the hands of the authorities, I told them, my voice cutting through Stephanie's weeping. The audio file of this conversation is currently uploading to a secure encrypted cloud server. The clock has run out. Bradley stood frozen, staring blankly at the floor. He looked like a ghost haunting his own funeral. "Get out," I ordered, pointing toward the heavy oak doors. "Gather your coats, walk out of this building, and get out of my sight before the federal agents arrive in this lobby to put you in handcuffs." They did not argue. They did not attempt to negotiate. The fight was permanently drained from their veins. William struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on the table for support. He grabbed Barbara's arm, pulling his weeping wife toward the exit. Stephanie stumbled after them, her pristine white dress stained with spilled water, leaving her husband standing alone in the ruins of his own making. I watched them shuffle through the doorway, a parade of broken predators marching toward their inevitable reckoning. The war was over, and it was time to collect the spoils. Welcome to the final chapter of this story on Morning Revenge. If you have followed this journey, from the freezing steakhouse to the glass conference room, you know that karma rarely operates on a predictable schedule. But when the scales finally balance, they do not leave any room for negotiation. Please take a moment to subscribe and support the channel, because the conclusion to this saga is a masterclass in watching the dominoes fall exactly where they belong. The collapse of the Harris family illusion did not take long. Once the structural supports were kicked out from under their feet in that downtown legal office, gravity did the rest of the work. 3 days after Bradley walked out of the mediation room, a fleet of dark, unmarked sport utility vehicles blocked the entrance to his commercial real estate firm. Federal agents wearing tactical windbreakers flooded the lobby. They carried out dozens of cardboard boxes filled with hard drives, paper ledgers, and encrypted servers. The local news stations interrupted their morning broadcasts to show live helicopter footage of my brother-in-law being escorted out of the glass building in handcuffs. The state auditors unraveled the Ponzi scheme in less than a week. The Securities and Exchange Commission traced the empty escrow accounts directly to the offshore payment processors. Faced with an insurmountable mountain of digital evidence and a recorded confession to extortion, Bradley did not fight the charges. He accepted a global plea agreement to avoid a protracted public trial that would have exposed the full lethal extent of the underground gambling syndicate. He is currently serving an 80-month sentence in a federal correctional facility out of state. His tailored charcoal blazers were traded for standard-issue khaki uniforms. He lost his freedom, his reputation, and his leverage, all in the span of a single month. The fallout caught Stephanie in its undertow, dragging her down into the very financial ruin she had tried to pin on me. The federal government moved swiftly to seize their assets, liquidating the luxury vehicles, freezing their domestic bank accounts, and auctioning the contents of their pristine suburban home to reimburse the defrauded commercial investors. My sister filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy before the first snow of the season had even begun to melt. The sprawling estate she felt so entitled to inherit vanished like smoke. She was forced to move into a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of Bismarck. The country club quietly revoked her membership. Her affluent suburban friends, the same women who had eagerly participated in the online smear campaign against me, stopped returning her phone calls. The pristine social identity she guarded with such venomous dedication dissolved into thin air. She became a ghost in her own hometown. William and Barbara faced a slower, more agonizing descent into the reality they had created. The national mortgage lender did not care about my father's previous status as a regional bank manager. They cared about the delinquent third mortgage. The bank formally foreclosed on the Elm Street Colonial, initiating the eviction process. The social elite of the capital city, the very people William tried to impress by stealing my college fund a decade ago, abandoned my parents the moment the scandal broke. The whispers in the country club dining rooms turned toxic. My parents were forced to pack 40 years of accumulated vanity antique furniture and designer clothing into rented moving trucks under the cover of darkness to avoid the staring eyes of their wealthy neighbors. They relocated to a small vinyl-sided duplex with a shared driveway and a chain-link fence. They lost their kingdom, and they lost it because they bet their entire future on a charismatic fraudster. The Elm Street Colonial went to a public county auction in early spring. The bank set a floor price to recoup the outstanding debt, expecting local developers to bid on the prime suburban acreage. They did not anticipate a holding company out of Delaware, operating under the financial umbrella of Silver Sage Equities, submitting a preemptive all-cash offer that dwarfed the asking price. I bought my childhood home. I did not buy it to live in it. I did not buy it to preserve the memories of the mahogany dining table or the sprawling manicured lawn. I bought the property to erase it from the map. I hired an independent commercial demolition crew. On a crisp Tuesday morning, I parked my 10-year-old Subaru across the street from the estate. The neighborhood was quiet, the air sharp with the scent of thawing frost. I stood on the sidewalk holding a paper cup of hot coffee, watching a heavy yellow excavator roll off a flatbed trailer. Its steel treads chewed into the pristine asphalt of the driveway. The diesel engine roared a deep mechanical growl that echoed off the neighboring houses. The operator swung the long mechanical arm toward the front facade of the Colonial. The heavy steel bucket crashed through the roof of the formal dining room. It was the exact room where my father had dropped a cardboard box onto my lap, gifting me yellow rubber boots and telling me I would spend my life digging in the dirt. The impact shattered the bay windows. The wooden framing groaned, buckled, and caved inward, sending a thick plume of white plaster dust into the morning air. I watched the physical monument to my psychological conditioning turn into a pile of splintered wood, twisted copper pipe, and crushed drywall. I watched the excavator tear down the walls that had confined me, the roof that had sheltered their arrogance, and the foundation built on stolen tuition money. I did not feel vindictive. I felt an incredible weightless peace. The chains that had tethered my self-worth to their approval snapped clean in half. I ordered the crew to clear the debris, haul away the wreckage, and level the earth until nothing remained but raw, exposed soil. On that very spot where they raised their golden child and plotted their extortion, I poured a new concrete foundation. I used a fraction of my land sale profits to finance the construction of a state-of-the-art, eco-friendly commercial facility. I dedicated the building as the primary headquarters for a new agricultural foundation. The organization is designed specifically to fund, educate, and empower female entrepreneurs across North Dakota. We provide seed grants to young women who want to cultivate their own land, women who have been told their ideas are worthless mud pits, women who lack the capital to start their lives because someone else stole their future. My parents found out about the foundation when the local Bismarck newspaper ran a prominent feature on the grand opening ribbon-cutting ceremony. They recognized the street address printed in the article. They realized exactly who had purchased their lost kingdom and leveled it to the ground. The realization must have been a bitter pill to swallow. A few days after the article circulated, the blocked call logs on my secure phone began to populate. William and Barbara tried to reach out from their rented duplex. They left long, rambling voicemails on an old number I kept active solely for the purpose of monitoring their desperation. They wept into the receiver, begging for forgiveness, pleading for a second chance to be a real family. They claimed they had seen the error of their ways and wanted to make amends. I never listened to the audio files past the first few seconds. I deleted the messages, disconnected the old line, and permanently sealed the communication channels. Forgiveness is a concept reserved for people who make honest mistakes, not for predators who apologize only after they have been disarmed. True wealth is not a 9-figure bank balance sitting in a diversified trust. True wealth is the undeniable luxury of absolute silence. It is the freedom to walk through your life without carrying the heavy, suffocating baggage of other people's expectations. I stand in my corner office today looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The view overlooks the sprawling experimental research gardens we planted exactly where their colonial living room used to be. The green shoots are breaking through the dark soil, thriving in the harsh Dakota climate. I did not need their validation to succeed. I did not need their money to build an empire. I only needed the conviction to walk away from the table when the game was rigged. I am a titan of industry, standing tall, resolute, and entirely unbothered, built from the very dirt they once mocked. We often look at stories of spectacular downfall and focus solely on the final deafening crash, the federal indictments, the shattered glass in a high-rise boardroom, the heavy yellow excavator tearing through a suburban colonial roof. But the collapse of the Harris family did not begin with a forged signature on a diner napkin or an offshore gambling syndicate. It began decades earlier, rooted quietly in the everyday choices made within the walls of a traditional American home. Rosalind's journey from the mocked daughter digging in the Dakota dirt to the architect of her family's reckoning is more than a tale of justice. It is a profound, cautionary reflection on the sacred duty of parenting, the weight of family responsibility, and the generational consequences of emotional blindness. In the landscape of American culture, the traditional family structure is frequently idealized as a sanctuary. It is meant to be the incubator where honesty is modeled, where fairness is the baseline expectation, and where children are guided to discover their unique potential without condition. We are taught that the home is a safe harbor. Yet for Rosalind, the estate on Elm Street was not a harbor. It was a transactional ledger. Her parents, William and Barbara, treated their children not as independent human beings deserving of guidance, but as volatile stocks in a social portfolio. When parents prioritize community status, country club memberships, and the pristine illusion of success over the emotional well-being of their children, they quietly plant the seeds of their own destruction. Consider the dynamic cultivated between Rosalind and her younger sister Stephanie. True family responsibility demands fairness and equitable distribution of support, grace, and discipline. Instead, William and Barbara engineered a toxic dichotomy, designating a golden child and a scapegoat. Stephanie was shielded, excessively praised, and ultimately tethered to a man who mirrored her parents' absolute worst traits, a superficial broker who valued appearance over substance. Rosalind, conversely, was left to absorb the mockery-handed cheap rubber boots as a punchline to entertain extended relatives at Thanksgiving dinner. When parents fail to practice basic fairness, they do not merely harm the scapegoat, they cripple the favored child. By constantly bailing out Bradley and shielding Stephanie from the harsh consequences of poor choices, William and Barbara robbed them of resilience. They taught their youngest daughter that love is conditional upon projecting perfection. They taught her that mistakes are to be hidden, swept under the rug, or paid off with someone else's stolen future. This is the antithesis of long-term guidance. A parent's job is not to pave a frictionless road for their child, nor is it to finance their illusions. It is to equip them with the moral and emotional tools to navigate a difficult world with integrity. Because Stephanie lacked those tools, the moment the illusion cracked, she was left entirely defenseless, weeping in a public lobby, unable to comprehend the grim reality of her husband's crimes. The most devastating failure in the Harris household, however, was the profound absence of honesty and emotional awareness. Emotional awareness requires a parent to look at their child and see them for who they genuinely are, rather than what they can provide to the family image. William could not see Rosalind's quiet determination or her brilliant work ethic. He could only see that her agricultural ambitions did not generate the immediate social currency he craved among his peers. His ego was so fragile, so dependent on the validation of other men in tailored suits, that he committed the ultimate betrayal. He drained his eldest daughter's college fund to save face over a bouncing country club check, trading her youth and financial stability for a $5,000 ego boost. This act of theft was the death of his parental authority. When a parent operates with such profound deceit, the family structure rots from the inside out. You cannot teach a child honesty while you are quietly picking their pocket in the dark. You cannot demand family loyalty when your own loyalty is up for sale to the highest bidder. Rosalind survived not because of her parents' long-term guidance, but in spite of its total absence. She had to parent herself. She learned the value of a dollar by working double shifts and paying off predatory loans. She learned the value of silence and strategy by watching her mother gossip and her father boast. She took the raw, bitter materials they handed her and forged an impenetrable armor. Yet Rosalind's ultimate victory was not just financial. The $93 million was merely the instrument that forced the truth to the surface. Her true triumph was her emotional emancipation. She recognized that she did not owe her loyalty to a system designed to exploit her. She set a boundary made of steel. In doing so, she broke a generational curse, ensuring that her own future and the futures of the women she now empowers through her agricultural foundation would be built on solid, honest ground, rather than the shifting sands of a Ponzi scheme. Her story resonates deeply because it holds a mirror up to our own lives. We all know what it feels like to seek validation from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it. We all know the quiet ache of being misunderstood by the very people who were supposed to understand us best. If Rosalind's journey through the fire and her unapologetic rise speaks to the battles you have fought behind closed doors, you are not alone. There is a community of survivors who have turned their scars into leverage and their boundaries into fortresses. If you want to hear more narratives about reclaiming your power, please follow the channel Morning Revenge, where we share stories of people who stopped waiting for an apology and started building their own empires. As we look back at the rubble of the colonial house on Elm Street, now replaced by the thriving green shoots of a research garden, a lingering question remains in the cold air. Parenting is an act of legacy. Every word spoken, every silent judgment passed, and every hidden choice made behind closed doors acts as water poured onto the roots of the next generation. We mold the future with our daily habits. But what happens when the people entrusted to plant those roots decide to salt the earth? Instead, Rosalind built an empire on the very dirt her father mocked, proving that sometimes the harshest environments cultivate the strongest foundations. Yet one has to wonder, as she looks out over the vast, quiet expanse of her new life, free from the noise and the demands of the bloodline she severed, she is entirely secure, entirely self-made, and entirely untouchable. But when you are forced to burn down the only home you ever knew just to stay warm, does the fire ever truly stop burning? Or do you simply learn to live comfortably in the glow of the ashes, wondering who you might have become if the soil hadn't been poisoned from the very start?